When Clara Holloway stepped off the train in Black Ridge, plump, patched clothes, all her possessions fitting into an old bag, the whole town laughed at her. They said she wouldn't survive a week in this wilderness. They said no rancher would take someone like her. But Silas Boone saw what the town missed, the determination in the woman's eyes. And his decision that afternoon changed everything. Please like, comment the name of the city you're watching so I know how far this story has come. And subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the extraordinary journey ahead. The train pulled into Black Ridge just after 3 in the afternoon, when the sun hung low and mean over the flatlands and the dust hadn't settled from the last freight wagon that had come through 2 hours before. It was the kind of town that looked like it had been dropped there by accident. A scattering of rough-hewn buildings along a single main street, a livery stable at one end, a general store at the other, and not much between them worth remarking on. The mountains in the distance were beautiful, maybe, if you had the patience to look past the mud and the manure and the general atmosphere of a place that had been struggling for so long it had forgotten what thriving felt like. Clara Holloway stepped off the train last. She'd been sitting near the back of the car the entire journey from Harwick, which was 2 days and 1 uncomfortable night away. She hadn't slept much. The seat was narrow, and the man across from her had snored with the consistency of a sawmill, and somewhere around midnight she'd given up and just sat watching the darkness move past the window, holding her bag on her lap like it might disappear if she let go. The bag was old, canvas gone gray at the corners, one strap replaced with a length of rope her neighbor Mrs. Aldrich had given her the morning she left. Inside it was everything Clara owned: 2 dresses, a wool coat with a missing button, her mother's recipe book, a small folding knife her father had carried until he couldn't anymore, $43 folded inside a handkerchief, and a tin cup she'd had since she was 12. Not much, but it was hers, and she'd learned a long time ago that the weight of what you carried wasn't always measured by the bag. She came down the train steps carefully, holding the iron railing with one hand, and when her boots touched the platform, she stopped and looked at Black Ridge for the first time. It looked back at her. There were maybe a dozen people on or near the platform, a few waiting for freight, a couple just standing around the way men did in small towns when they didn't have anything better to do. One of them, a thick-shouldered man with a ginger mustache, said something to the fellow beside him. Clara didn't hear the words. She heard the laugh that followed. She'd heard that laugh before. Different mouths, same sound. She straightened her back, adjusted the bag on her shoulder, and walked to the end of the platform. She had an address written on a folded piece of paper in her coat pocket: Boone Ranch, 4 miles east on the Millhaven Road. She'd answered the advertisement in the Harwick Courier 3 weeks ago, had exchanged 2 letters with a man named Silas Boone, who wrote in short, practical sentences with no flourishes and several crossed-out words, as if writing didn't come naturally to him. The advertisement had been plain enough. Housekeeper and cook needed at working cattle ranch. Quiet, capable woman preferred. Inquire to S. Boone, Black Ridge. No mention of wages in the first letter, which she'd asked about in her reply. He'd told her in the second letter. Reasonable money, room and board included. The work would be hard. She'd written back that she understood hard work. He hadn't responded after that, but he also hadn't told her not to come. She was choosing to take that as a yes. You lost, honey? The woman who said it was standing outside the general store, arms crossed, watching Clara with the particular expression of someone who has already made up their mind about what they're seeing. She was lean and sharp-featured, maybe 50, wearing a clean apron over a dark dress. No, ma'am, Clara said. Just getting my bearings. Where you headed? Boone Ranch. Something shifted in the woman's face. Not surprise exactly, more like confirmation of something she'd suspected. You the one who answered his advertisement? I am. The woman looked her over slowly, not even pretending to be subtle about it. Clara was used to this too. She was a tall woman, broad-shouldered and full-figured, and she'd spent enough years in the world to know that some people couldn't look at a body like hers without feeling entitled to an opinion. You know what kind of shape that ranch is in? The woman asked. I know it's a working cattle operation. Beyond that, I don't know much. It's barely holding on is what it is. The woman shook her head slightly, like Clara had just told her she planned to swim across a river in November. And Silas Boone's got his hands full enough without having to worry about, well, she stopped herself. Without having to worry about what? Clara asked. The woman didn't answer that directly. It's a long walk out to the Millhaven Road, she said instead. You sure you're up for it? I'll manage, Clara said. Thank you for your concern. She kept walking. Behind her, she heard the woman say something to someone else, lower this time, not meant to carry, but the sound of the laughter that followed did, and Clara counted her steps for a while after that, the way she'd learned to do when she needed to keep her face calm. 1, 2, 3. The main street of Black Ridge was unpaved, rutted from wagon wheels, and smelled like every other frontier town she'd passed through. Horse, smoke, wet wood, something frying somewhere. A group of men outside the barber shop watched her pass. One of them, younger, maybe 20, cupped his hands around his mouth and said something that made his companions crack up. Clara didn't slow down. She'd learned that slowing down only encouraged them. She was past the edge of town and onto the dirt road heading east when she heard boots behind her. Hey, miss! She turned. A young boy, 12, maybe 13, was jogging to catch up, holding a battered hat to his head with one hand. He was skinny and dark-haired and had the slightly wary look of a kid who'd been bounced around enough to be cautious about everything. He stopped a few feet away, catching his breath. You going to the Boone place? I am. I can show you the turn. It's not obvious. Clara studied him for a moment. What's your name? Noah. You live out there? Yeah. He said it without much inflection. Silas is my uncle. She shifted her bag to the other shoulder. All right, Noah, lead the way. He fell into step beside her, and for a while neither of them said anything. The road stretched east through dry grass and scattered juniper, the mountains growing incrementally more detailed on the horizon. A hawk turned lazy circles somewhere overhead. The afternoon heat was easing off, just barely. People in town say stuff, Noah said finally, not looking at her. I noticed. They said stuff when I came here too, after my dad died. He picked up a rock from the road, turned it in his fingers, threw it into the grass. I don't think you should pay attention to them. I don't plan to, Clara said. He glanced at her sideways. You're bigger than I expected. I know. I didn't mean it bad. I know that too. She paused. You can say what you actually mean. I don't break easy. He thought about that. I just wondered if it was going to be hard. The work. My uncle says the work is hard. All work worth doing is hard, Clara said. That's not the part that matters. He picked up another rock, held on to this one. What's the part that matters? She thought about it honestly, because the question deserved an honest answer. Showing up the next day, she said, and the day after that. Noah chewed on that for a while. They walked another quarter mile before he pointed to a gap in the fence line where a narrow track broke away from the main road. A wooden post stood at the entrance with a sun-weathered board nailed to it. Boone, painted in letters that had mostly weathered off. Down there, he said, about a mile. They turned onto the track. The ranch came into view gradually, the way most things that have seen better days tend to. A little at a time, so you can adjust your expectations before you get there. First the barn, large and practical, one side of the roof dipping slightly where something had given way and been patched with mismatched boards. Then the outbuildings, a chicken coop and a small smokehouse. Then the house itself. 2 stories, wide-fronted, built from good timber that had gone gray in the weather. The porch needed work. One of the front steps had been replaced with a plank laid flat, and the boards on either side were soft-looking. A split-rail fence lined the yard, half of it standing, half of it leaning or broken. It wasn't a ruin, but it wasn't well kept either. It was a place that had been fighting to stay alive for a while, and losing ground. A man was working near the fence line on the south side of the yard, pulling out a broken post with the focused effort of someone who'd already been at it for too long and wasn't close to done. He was big, broad through the shoulders, not young, but not yet what you'd call old, with dark hair going gray at the temples and hands that looked like they'd been worked hard every day of his adult life. He was wearing a battered canvas shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, and he was sweating through it. He looked up when he heard them come through the gate. Clara stopped about 20 feet away and let him look. She was used to the looking. She waited for his face to do what faces usually did. The flicker of something, the recalibration, the very slight shift that said, "This is not what I pictured." His face didn't do much of anything for a moment. He just looked at her, then at the bag on her shoulder, then back at her face. "Miss Holloway," he said. Not a question. "Mr. Boone." He pulled off one glove and crossed the yard toward her. His hand when he offered it was rough and still dirty from the post-hole work, and he noticed that himself and almost pulled it back, but she took it before he could. "You made good time," he said. "Train was on schedule. Noah find you all right?" "Met her on the road," Noah said from behind Clara. "She was doing fine." Silas looked at his nephew for a moment, something in his expression that was hard to read, then back at Clara. He seemed like a man who chose his words the way you'd choose your footing crossing a stream, one at a time, carefully. "I should tell you up front," he said. "The place is in worse shape than the letters might have suggested. I gathered that on the walk up. I can pay what I offered, but there's more to do than I let on. I didn't know how to put all of it in a letter without it sounding like I was asking for too much." "Were you asking for too much?" He considered this. "Probably." She looked at the house, then back at him. "Show me what I'm working with," she said. "Then we'll talk." He showed her. The kitchen was large and could be good. Solid wood stove, good natural light from 2 windows, a long work table that had survived years of use. But the shelves were chaotically organized. The floor had been scrubbed recently, but not well, and something had been spilled near the back wall and dealt with inadequately. The pantry held enough to eat on, but not comfortably. The stores were running low and hadn't been replenished with any real strategy. The main room was livable. The 2 upstairs bedrooms were rough. Silas's was plain and functional. Noah's was a boy's room in the way of having accumulated rocks and pieces of things, but no real warmth to it. The room she'd be using was off the kitchen, small, with a window that looked out toward the barn and a narrow bed with a decent mattress. Someone had left a folded blanket at the foot of it. She didn't ask who. She stood in the doorway of her room for a moment, setting things in her mind. "There's no housekeeper been here," she said. It wasn't an accusation. "Last woman left in February." Silas was standing in the hallway, one shoulder against the doorframe. "Before that, a few others. None of them stayed." "Why not?" He rubbed the back of his neck. "The work, the isolation. One of them didn't care for the way the ranch was going. One of them—" He stopped. "I'm not easy to work for. I don't make conversation. I don't ask how people are doing. I'm told that's a problem." It's not a problem for me," Clara said. "I'm not here to make conversation. I'm here to work." Something in him seemed to settle slightly, like a held breath let out. "All right. I'll need to look at the accounts. Whatever you have on the finances of the operation." He blinked. "The accounts?" "Supplies are low and not organized. I can't plan meals or manage the household without knowing what's coming in and going out. I'll need access to the books." He was quiet for a moment. "Most housekeepers don't." "I'm not most housekeepers." He looked at her for a long moment, not sizing her up the way people in town had, not looking for something to judge. He was just looking the way a man looks when he's trying to figure out whether what he's seeing is real. "I'll get the books," he said. The first week was about finding the truth of the place. Clara rose before dawn every morning and went to bed after everyone else. Not out of martyrdom, but because there was simply more to do than the daylight hours allowed, and she had never in her life been someone who let a list of tasks shame her into quitting. She cataloged the pantry, replaced the chaotic shelving system with a logical one, and identified what needed to be replenished in the next supply run and in what order of priority. She cleaned the kitchen properly. The floor, the walls, the corners where grease had accumulated. And she did it without making a production of it. She also cooked. This turned out to matter more than anything else, at least in the first week. Silas had been eating like a man who cooked because he had to, not because he had any particular belief in the activity. The meals that first evening and the days that followed, nothing elaborate, just solid cooking with what was available, produced a change in the household that Clara noticed before either of the males did. Noah started appearing at mealtimes without being called. Silas started eating slower. It was a small thing, but small things were how you built anything that lasted. Noah was the more complicated problem. He was a good kid underneath the guarded surface, curious, observant, quick with numbers when he applied himself. But he'd learned to hold most of himself back, the way kids did when they'd been handed enough losses to make them suspicious of anything that looked like it might stick around. His father had died 14 months ago. Before that, from what Clara could piece together from what wasn't said rather than what was, the boy had moved around a fair amount. He was 12 years old and had a 12-year-old's ability to be in the same room with you while remaining completely unreachable. Clara didn't push him. She'd learned that the worst thing you could do with a kid like that was make them feel like a project. Instead, she just included him, asked him questions about the ranch that she actually needed answers to, because he'd been there longer than she had and paid attention to things in the way only kids could, showed him how she organized the accounts when she was going through the books, because the problem-solving of it seemed to interest him. Read aloud in the evenings when the work was done, not to him specifically, but near him, the way you might start a fire near someone who's cold without making them admit they need the warmth. By the end of the first week, he was asking what she was reading. By the end of the second, he was sitting at the kitchen table with her after dinner while she went through the household accounts, doing his own arithmetic problems on a spare piece of paper. Silas noticed, though he said nothing about it. He was a man who observed more than he spoke, and Clara had come to recognize the particular quality of attention he paid to things that mattered to him. A stillness, a kind of careful watching, like he was taking a measurement. The trouble from town came in the form of a woman named Ruth Elmore, who arrived at the ranch in the second week, driving her own wagon with the confidence of someone who had decided they had a right to be there. Ruth Elmore was maybe 45, angular and well-dressed, with the air of a woman who ran things and expected people to know it. She was married to the man who owned the lumber business in Black Ridge, which made her locally significant in the way that money made people significant in small towns. She'd known Silas for years, apparently, and had strong opinions about the running of his household. Clara was in the yard hanging laundry when the wagon came through the gate. She watched it come without stopping what she was doing. Ruth pulled up and looked at her from the seat. "You're the new housekeeper." "I am. Clara something. Clara Holloway." Ruth climbed down from the wagon with the ease of someone accustomed to it and stood in the yard looking at the house, then at Clara, then back at the house. "Place looks better than it did," she said. Not warmly. "Thank you. I'm Ruth Elmore. I've known Silas since before his wife passed. He mentioned he had good neighbors. He hadn't, actually, but she felt the remark was in order. Ruth looked at her directly then. "I'm going to say something, and I'd like you to hear it plainly." "All right. People in town are talking about the kind of woman Silas has brought into this house. I'm not saying they're right to talk, but they are, and I thought someone ought to tell you." "I appreciate that," Clara said. "The thing is," Ruth stopped. She seemed to be deciding something. "The thing is, Silas Boone is not a man who makes decisions carelessly. He doesn't do much carelessly, actually. So when he decides to hire someone, I have to assume he had reasons, whatever the town thinks about it." Clara waited. "I just want to know if you're planning to stay," Ruth said, "because that boy does not need another person walking out on him." It was the most honest thing anyone in Black Ridge had said to Clara since she arrived, and she recognized it for what it was, not an attack, but a test. The kind of test that only gets offered once. "I'm planning to stay," Clara said. Ruth looked at her for a moment, the same look of taking a measurement that Clara had learned to recognize in Silas. Then she nodded, once. "Good," she said. "I'll come back in a few weeks, see how things are going." She climbed back into the wagon without going into the house and drove back the way she came. Clara watched her go, then went back to the laundry. 3 weeks in, Silas came to find her in the kitchen one evening after Noah had gone to bed. She was at the table with the account books, working through the numbers she'd been gathering since she arrived. Not just the household accounts, but the ranch records, which he'd let her look at after that first day, somewhat to his own surprise, she suspected. He sat down across from her without being invited, which she took as a good sign. It meant he'd stopped treating her like a guest. "What's the verdict?" he said. She showed him what she'd found, and the picture wasn't good. The cattle operation was generating income, but unpredictably. They'd had losses last season that hadn't been fully recovered, and the spending had continued at a rate that assumed a better year than they'd had. There were 2 outstanding debts she'd found, One to the feed supplier in Millhaven, and one to a man named Garfield, whose relation to the ranch she hadn't established yet. "Who's Garfield?" she asked. Silas was quiet for a moment. "He loaned me money when the first housekeeper left. For wages, supplies. I haven't been able to pay it back yet." "How long ago?" 8 months. "What are the terms?" He told her. They were not good terms. "That's the most pressing problem," Clara said. "The other supplier will work with you. Late payment, some negotiation. But this Garfield looks like he's set this up to collect in other ways if he doesn't get cash." "What other ways?" She hesitated. "He has a lien on the southeast pasture. You know that?" From the look on his face, he did not entirely know that. "It's in the second document you gave me," she said carefully. "The one with the stamp from the county clerk." Silas sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling. He put both hands flat on the table and then took them off again. He was very still for a moment, in the way of a man trying to decide whether to be angry and at what. "I should have looked at those more carefully," he said finally. "You were managing other things." "That's not an excuse." "No," she agreed. "It isn't, but it explains it." He was quiet again. Outside, something moved in the yard. A horse shifting in the corral, probably, and the night sounds of the ranch settled around them. "Can it be fixed?" he said. "Most things can be fixed," Clara said. "It depends on how much ground you're willing to cover and how fast." He looked at her directly then. "What would you do?" She had in fact already thought this through. She laid it out, a plan that involved renegotiating the feed supplier's terms, increasing cattle to market sooner than planned, cutting certain operational costs for the next 2 months, and approaching Garfield with a partial payment and a formal schedule for the remainder before he had any reason to act on the lien. Silas listened to all of it without interrupting. "You've done this kind of thing before," he said when she was done. "I kept my family's accounts for 4 years before I came here," she said. "After my father got sick. Someone had to." "Your mother?" "Gone when I was 7. He nodded slowly. "Mine too." He paused. "I'm sorry about your father." "He passed last year. That's partly why I answered your advertisement." He absorbed that. "You needed somewhere to go." "I needed somewhere to be useful," she said. "That's not quite the same thing." He seemed to think about the difference. "No," he said. "I suppose it's not." They sat for a while in the kitchen with the lamp burning between them and the account book spread on the table, and outside the dark settled completely over the flatlands and the mountains were just a shape against the sky. And it was the first time since she'd stepped off that train that Clara felt something close to ease. Not comfort exactly, not yet, but the particular sense of being in the right place doing the right thing, which was a feeling she'd learned not to take for granted. "I'll start on the Garfield letter tomorrow," she said. "All right," Silas said. He stood up, pushed the chair in. "Thank you, Miss Holloway." "Clara," she said, "if we're going to be going through financial records together, you might as well use my first name." He was halfway to the door. He stopped, and something that wasn't quite a smile crossed his face. Brief, a little surprised, like a window opened in a room that had been shut a long time. "Good night, Clara." "Good night, Mr. Boone." He paused again at the door. "Silas," he said. And then he was gone, and she could hear his boots on the stairs, and she sat for a moment longer with the lamp and the account books before she finally closed them up and went to bed. Down the hall, the ranch breathed around her. The creak of settling timber, the distant night sound of cattle, the wind picking up off the flatlands the way it did after dark. All of it rough and real and nothing close to easy. She thought about the woman outside the general store and the men outside the barber shop, and the look on their faces when she'd walked through Black Ridge for the first time. Then she thought about Ruth Elmore, who had driven out just to ask if she was staying, and Noah, who had met her on the road and walked her home, and Silas Boone, who had looked at her that first afternoon across the broken fence and said, "Miss Holloway, the way you say a name when you've been waiting to put a face to it." She turned off the lamp. Outside, something rustled in the grass beyond the fence. A night bird called once from somewhere near the barn. Clara Holloway lay in the dark in her small room off the kitchen of a struggling ranch on the edge of nowhere, and she thought, "I'm staying." It felt like the first real decision she'd made in a long time. The letter to Garfield went out on a Tuesday, carried by Noah on the supply run into Black Ridge with Silas. Claire had written 3 drafts before she was satisfied. Not because she lacked the words, but because she understood that tone mattered as much as content when you were asking a man who held leverage over you to consider patience. The final version was neither pleading nor aggressive. It laid out a payment schedule, acknowledged the debt plainly, and made clear that the Boone Ranch intended to honor its obligations in full. What it didn't say, but what any man who read carefully would understand, was that Clara had found the lien, had read the terms, and knew exactly what ground she was standing on. She was not asking for charity. She was giving notice. Silas had read it twice at the kitchen table the morning before the run, and when he finished, he set it down and looked at her in that measuring way he had. "You sure about the tone?" he said. "What's wrong with it?" "Nothing's wrong with it. It's, He searched for the word. Confident. "Is that a problem?" "Garfield doesn't like being handled." "He's not being handled," Clara said. "He's being addressed like a business partner instead of a creditor who holds a club. There's a difference." Silas thought about that. "All right," he said, and folded the letter. "We'll see what he does with it." What Garfield did with it was nothing, for 2 weeks. Then a reply came back, brief, businesslike, 2 sentences, saying he was willing to discuss revised terms when Silas came to his office in Millhaven. Not a yes, not exactly a no either. Clara considered it a start. In those 2 weeks, the ranch had not stood still waiting. The work never waited. There were meals to cook and accounts to keep, and the ongoing, relentless logistics of a cattle operation. The feeding and checking and moving of animals, the maintenance of equipment that was always one hard use away from breaking down, the fence line that needed repair and kept getting pushed to tomorrow. Silas and his hired hand, a quiet older man named Dix, who lived in the bunkhouse and worked without complaint and said about 30 words a week, handled the livestock. Clara handled everything else. She'd found her rhythm in the kitchen within the first week, and by the third she had extended it outward into the rest of the house in the methodical way she did most things, one problem at a time, starting with what would make the most difference. The porch step that had been a plank laid flat got replaced with proper lumber she'd salvaged from the unused boards stacked beside the smokehouse. She'd asked Silas if she could use them. He'd said yes, and then watched from the yard with an expression she couldn't quite read while she fitted the boards and hammered them level. "You do carpentry?" he said. "I do what needs doing," she said. "Hand me that other nail, would you?" He handed her the nail. She was not, she would have been the first to admit, doing any of this perfectly. The porch board was level, but the surface wasn't sanded, and she'd hit her thumb with the hammer twice and said things about it that would have scandalized Mrs. Aldrich back in Harwick. The financial strategy she'd laid out for Silas was solid, but depended on the cattle market holding, which it might not. The meals were good, but sometimes she misjudged quantities and they ran short. Or she was too tired to think carefully about what she was making, and dinner ended up being something functional rather than something worth eating. She was doing the work of several people. She knew it, and Silas knew it, and neither of them said anything about it directly, which was a kind of unspoken agreement she'd come to appreciate about him. He didn't offer sympathy, and she didn't ask for it, and somehow that made the work feel more honest. What she hadn't expected was how hard the isolation would hit her on certain evenings. Not the physical isolation, the distance from town, the long, quiet days that she could manage. It was the other kind, the kind that came when she sat in the main room after Noah had gone to bed, and Silas was out doing a last check on the horses, and the house settled around her, and she was aware with sudden sharp clarity that there was no one in the world who would notice if she wasn't there. Her father was gone. Her 2 school friends from Harwick had married years ago and moved away. Mrs. Aldrich had been kind, genuinely, but kindness wasn't the same as belonging. She'd sit with that feeling for a while, and then she'd pick up the accounts or find something that needed mending, because she'd learned that the best antidote to that particular ache was forward motion. It was on one of those evenings that Noah appeared in the doorway of the main room in his socks and his nightshirt, carrying the thin arithmetic primer she'd found in the bottom of a box in his room. "I can't make this work," he said, holding up the book like it had personally offended him. "What problem?" He came in and sat on the floor near her chair and opened the book to a dog-eared page. "This one. I've done it 4 different ways and I get 4 different answers." She looked at it. It was a word problem about water flowing into barrels at different rates, the kind of problem that was harder to untangle than it looked. Show me how you did it the first time, she said. He showed her. He'd actually been close, had the right method, but had confused which rate applied to which barrel. She pointed to where it had gone sideways, and he looked at it, and then something clicked behind his eyes, and he said, "Oh, oh," with the particular irritation of someone realizing they almost had it. "You were thinking correctly," Clara said. "You just switched two numbers." "That's the worst kind of wrong," Noah said darkly. "It is," she agreed, "because it means you knew how to do it." He worked through it again with the corrected numbers, got the right answer, and sat looking at it for a moment with the satisfaction that only comes from solving something you've been stuck on. "My dad used to help me with arithmetic," he said, not looking at her. Clara waited. "He wasn't very good at it either," Noah said. "But he tried." A pause. "He'd make up different versions of the problem with cattle instead of barrels. Said it was more practical." "That's actually smart," Clara said. "The best way to understand a concept is to put it in a context that means something to you." "Can we do that? Right now?" "If you're not busy." She wasn't busy, or rather she was always busy, but the accounts could wait. "Bring that lamp closer," she said. "Let's rewrite the problem." They were at it for nearly an hour, rewriting arithmetic problems using cattle and pasture sizes and fence lengths until the primer's abstract numbers had been replaced by things you could see and touch. And Noah was working through them with a kind of energized focus she hadn't seen from him before. He was good at this when he cared about it. She filed that away. When he finally went back to bed, she sat in the quiet for a while thinking about his father, a man she'd never known, who had tried to help his son with arithmetic even when he wasn't good at it. She thought about the shape of a loss like that, what it left behind. Then she picked up the accounts and went back to work. The gossip from town arrived in the form of Mabel Greer, who ran the laundry and was apparently the central nervous system of Black Ridge's information network. She showed up one afternoon in mid-April driving a small cart, ostensibly to return a shirt that had been left at her establishment months ago by Dick's, which was a reason so thin it barely stood up on its own. Clara met her at the gate because she'd been in the yard and had no reason to pretend she wasn't. Mabel Greer was a round-faced, cheerful-looking woman of about 60, who had the gift of appearing entirely guileless while simultaneously extracting information from people without them knowing it was happening. Clara recognized the type within the first 2 minutes. "You must be the new housekeeper," Mabel said, climbing down from the cart. "We've all been wondering." "All been wondering what?" Clara asked pleasantly. Mabel waved a hand. "How you're finding it out here. It's isolated, isn't it? The last few couldn't manage." "I'm managing fine, thank you." "You've been keeping to the ranch," said as an observation but with an undertone. "There's a lot of work here," Clara said. "I haven't had much reason to come into town." Mabel looked at the house, which did look better, objectively, than it had 6 weeks ago, and at Clara, and at the house again. "Place looks better," she said. "Thank you. Silas treating you all right?" "Mr. Boone is a fair employer." Something shifted in Mabel's expression, a recalibration. She'd been expecting a different kind of conversation, Clara suspected, more personal, more revealing. "People worry about him," Mabel said, and now her voice had gone gentler, more genuine. "He's had a hard few years, the ranch going the way it did, and then his brother's boy landing on him." "Noah," Clara said. "He's a good kid." "He's a troubled kid," Mabel said. "Was in 3 fights in town before you came. Silas didn't know what to do with him." She paused. "I hear he's not fighting anymore." Clara said nothing. "Whatever you're doing," Mabel said, "it seems to be helping." "He just needed someone to take him seriously," Clara said. "Kids generally do." Mabel looked at her for a long moment, and the cheerful, guileless expression had settled into something more direct. "Some people in town say things," she said, "about you. I'm not going to pretend they don't. I know. I want you to know I'm not one of them. I appreciate that. And I want you to know something else." Mabel lowered her voice slightly, though there was no one within earshot. "There's a man named Garfield in Mill Haven. The Boone Ranch has dealings with him. You should know what kind of man he is." Clara went still. "Tell me," Mabel told her. It took a few minutes and involved 2 other ranches in the valley. Smaller ones, both of which had taken loans from Harlan Garfield in difficult years, and both of which had ended up losing portions of their land when the repayment terms, buried in the paperwork, had proven impossible to meet. One family had left the territory entirely. The other had reduced their operation to a fraction of what it had been and were barely surviving. "He does it carefully," Mabel said. "Nothing illegal exactly, but he knows what he's doing." "I know what he's doing too," Clara said. Mabel studied her. "You've seen the paperwork." "I've seen everything." Mabel nodded slowly. "Silas is a proud man," she said. "He doesn't ask for help well." "He doesn't need to ask," Clara said. "He just needs to let people who know what they're doing do what they know." Mabel looked at her for another moment and then did something Clara hadn't expected. She smiled, a real one, not the social kind. "You're going to be fine," she said. "I thought so when I heard you'd come. Now I'm sure of it." She got back in her cart, gave Clara the shirt she'd brought for Dick's, and drove back toward town. Clara stood at the gate for a moment after she left, holding Dick's shirt and thinking about Harlan Garfield and two families who no longer had what they'd worked for. Then she went inside and rewrote the letter. The second letter to Garfield was different from the first. It was shorter and it was very specific, and it referenced, without being dramatic about it, certain provisions in the original loan agreement that Garfield appeared to have misrepresented at signing. Clara had found them in a third reading of the documents, buried in language that was designed to be overlooked. They didn't change the debt, but they complicated Garfield's position considerably if he chose to press the lien. She showed it to Silas that evening. He read it standing at the kitchen counter, and she watched his face go through several different things. When he finished, he set it down. He picked it up and read the last paragraph again. "He's going to be angry," he said. "Probably. He has friends in Millhaven, county clerk, judge." "I know," Clara said, "but angry men make mistakes, and men who are used to winning the way Garfield does aren't used to dealing with someone who's read what they wrote." Silas was quiet for a moment. "Where'd you learn this?" "My father had a debt dispute once with a man back in Harwick. Creditor. Tried to collect more than he was owed and said the paperwork supported it." She paused. "I read the paperwork. And the creditor backed off." He was looking at her with that look again, the one she'd been seeing more often lately, where he was trying to work out whether she was real. "Clara," he said. "I want to say something." She waited. "I know this is more than what I offered when you answered that advertisement," he said. "The accounts and the legal reading and the—" He gestured at the letter. "That wasn't what I was asking for." "I know. I should pay you more." "You can't pay me more right now. That's the whole point of the letter." A short pause. "When this is settled," he said, "I'll pay you more." "I know you will," she said. "Now sign the bottom of that." He signed it. What? Spring turned the hills green in the way that only happened for about 3 weeks before the dry season burned it back to gold. And those 3 weeks were the most beautiful thing Clara had seen in years. She found herself stopping sometimes in the middle of work just to look at it. The green rolling up the slopes toward the ridgeline, the sky a particular shade of blue that seemed too good to be real. And then she'd feel slightly embarrassed about stopping and go back to what she'd been doing. She mentioned it once to Noah, who was old enough to appreciate landscape, but young enough to think anyone who stopped to look at one during the workday was probably a little strange. "It's not going anywhere," he said, not unkindly. "Everything's going somewhere," Clara said. "That's the whole point." He thought about that for most of the morning, and then at lunch said, "I think I know what you meant," and went back to eating without elaborating. She decided not to push it. In town, the gossip about her had not stopped. She'd heard most of it secondhand, from Ruth Elmore, who came back as promised and had become something closer to a real acquaintance, from Mabel, who dropped things off occasionally with the transparent excuse that they needed returning, from Dick's, who said almost nothing but had a face that communicated quite clearly when something was bothering him. The shape of it was consistent. Clara Holloway was too big for frontier work, too forward for a housekeeper, too comfortable with the account books for a woman who was supposed to be cooking and cleaning, and probably too something else that people adjusted depending on who was doing the telling. She didn't go into town for the first 6 weeks. When she finally did go, it was because Silas asked her to come on the supply run, saying she'd know better than he would what they needed and in what quantities. She wore her better dress and her hair up, and she walked into the general store beside him and made her purchases without hurrying and without making eye contact with the people who stared. And when the store owner, a flat-faced man named Craddock, who'd been one of the ones on the platform that first day, addressed his questions to Silas instead of her, even when she'd been the one speaking, she simply answered them anyway, calmly, until Craddock adjusted. It was Silas who surprised her. They were heading back to the wagon with the first load of supplies when a woman near the door of the dry goods store said something, not loud, not directly at Clara, but angled so it would carry. The words were about weight and about what a man like Silas must be thinking, and they had the particular cruelty of things said just out of reach. Silas stopped walking. He handed the crate he was carrying to Clara without looking at her, and he walked back to the door of the dry goods store, and he looked at the woman who'd spoken, a young, pretty woman who had not expected to be looked at directly, and he said quietly and without heat, "Mrs. Paxton, that's the last time you'll say something like that about someone in my household. Do you understand me?" The woman went red. "I'm not angry," Silas said. "I'm just being clear." He came back to the wagon, took the crate back from Clara, and loaded it into the bed. He didn't look at her for a moment. "You didn't have to do that," Clara said. "I know," he said. "I wanted to." She looked at him, at the side of his face. He was watching the horse, adjusting the harness needlessly. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. "Let's get the rest of the order," he said, and walked back into the store, and she followed. The response from Garfield came to Millhaven in mid-May, addressed to Silas, but with a tone that suggested Garfield had understood who actually wrote the letters. It proposed a meeting, revised terms. The lien on the southeast pasture would be removed in exchange for a fixed repayment schedule at a lower rate. It wasn't everything they'd wanted, but the lien being lifted was the critical thing, and they had it. Silas came home from Millhaven on a Thursday evening and found Clara in the kitchen and said, "It worked." And she said, "Good." And he said, "You should be proud of that." And she said, "I'm relieved. Pride comes later." He sat down at the kitchen table. "Noah's been asking when you're going to teach him to do accounts. He can start whenever he wants." "I told him that. He said he didn't want to bother you." She looked up. "Tell him he's not a bother." "I did." Silas leaned back in the chair, and she could see the tiredness in him. Not just the day's tiredness, but the longer kind, the accumulated weight of 2 years of fighting for something that kept threatening to slip away. "Clara," he said. "Yeah. When we had you write that advertisement, when I put it in the Harwick paper," he stopped. "I didn't know what I was asking for. I thought I was asking for someone to cook and keep the house clean and not leave inside of 3 months. She waited. "I was asking for more than that," he said. "I just didn't know how to say it." She was quiet for a moment. "Most people don't," she said finally, "know how to say what they actually need." He looked at her. "What did you need?" "When you answered it." She thought about the honest answer. "Somewhere I'd be useful," she said. "Somewhere the work meant something." A pause. "Somewhere I might matter to someone." The last part came out quieter than she intended. Silas didn't say anything. He wasn't a man who filled silences with reassurances. But something in his expression changed, opened slightly, the way a door opens that's been shut a long time. And he held her gaze for a moment longer than he usually did, and then he stood up and went to the stove where the coffee was still warm. "Supper smells good," he said. "Venison stew," she said. "It's nothing special." "It's something," he said. He poured 2 cups and set one in front of her without asking. "It's always something." She looked at the cup. Outside, the evening was settling in, the sky going the color of an old bruise behind the mountains, and the ranch was making its nighttime sounds. Dick's finishing up in the barn, the cattle quiet in the south pasture, the trees near the fence creaking in the first breath of wind. Noah came thundering down the stairs and appeared in the kitchen doorway with his shoes still on and his hair going in 4 directions. "Did it work?" he said, looking at his uncle. "With Garfield?" "It worked," Silas said. "Clara did it," Noah said. Not a question. "She wrote the letters," Silas said. I told everyone at the supply stop that our housekeeper was smarter than any banker in Mill Haven, Noah said, with the absolute confidence of someone who had no doubt whatsoever about this claim. You told everyone at the Silas started. Dix thought so too, Noah said. Can I have stew now? Clara was looking at her coffee cup, and if there was something in her expression that was more than just tiredness, she didn't make a production of it. She stood up and ladled stew into 3 bowls, and they sat at the kitchen table. The man, the boy, and the woman who had come here with one worn bag and $43 and a folding knife. And the meal was not perfect. The stew was slightly oversalted, and there was no bread because she'd forgotten to start the dough that morning. And Noah ate too fast and got a talking to about it. And outside the wind came up properly and rattled the kitchen window. None of it was smooth. None of it was easy. But the ranch was breathing. The accounts were in order. The lien was lifting. And tomorrow there would be more work, and she would do it. And the day after that too, and somewhere in the accumulation of those days, something was being built. Not perfect, not finished, not close to done, but real. That was, Clara had decided a long time ago, the only kind of thing worth building. She reached over and pushed Noah's bowl slightly to the right, so he'd stop elbowing her while he ate, and he said sorry without looking up from his food. And Silas caught her eye across the table and did not quite smile, but came close enough that she recognized it for what it was. She let herself have that just for a moment. Then she passed the pepper and got on with supper. The wedding was not what anyone would call an event. There was no church, no hired minister, no reception at the hotel in Black Ridge with its warped floorboards and its off-key piano. What there was, a circuit judge named Alderman who came through the valley every 6 weeks and agreed to perform the ceremony on a Tuesday afternoon in late June, Ruth Elmore and Mabel Greer standing in the yard as witnesses, Noah wearing his best shirt with the collar buttoned too tight and his hair flattened down with water that was already losing the fight against his natural inclination, and Silas in the dark jacket he'd last worn to his brother's funeral, which was the only formal thing he owned and which Clara had pressed carefully the night before without saying anything about where she knew he'd last worn it. She wore her better dress, the blue one, not the patched one, and she'd let her hair down and put it back up herself that morning 3 times before deciding the second attempt was good enough and leaving it alone. The ceremony took 11 minutes. Judge Alderman had the manner of a man who had performed a great many of these and had come to regard efficiency as its own form of respect. He asked the necessary questions in a clear voice. They answered them, and when it was done, he signed the paper and shook Silas's hand and nodded to Clara with something that might have been approval. Mabel cried. Ruth didn't, but she stood very straight, and her expression was the kind that covered things over. Noah shook Silas's hand with enormous seriousness, and then looked at Clara and said, "Does this mean you're definitely not leaving?" And she said yes, and he nodded like this was a business arrangement being confirmed, and went directly back to the house to change out of his good shirt. That evening they ate together at the kitchen table as they always did, and the food was the same food it would have been on any other Tuesday, and the ranch was the same ranch, and the work waiting for tomorrow was the same work. But something had shifted in the quality of the quiet, not dramatically, not in any way that could be pointed to exactly. Just a settling. The particular feeling of a thing that has been uncertain, becoming certain. Clara washed the dishes after dinner and Silas dried them, which he'd never done before, and neither of them remarked on it. That was the wedding. Summer came in hard that year, drier than the season before and hotter by a week. The creek that ran along the north boundary of the Boone property dropped to half its usual level by July, and Silas spent 3 days rerouting the cattle's water access before the problem got worse. Clara organized the water use in the house with the same systematic practicality she'd applied to the pantry 6 months ago. Conservation first, nothing wasted, priorities ranked. It was also in July that she understood she was pregnant. She sat with that knowledge for 3 days before she told Silas, not out of fear, but because she needed the time to place it properly in her mind. She was 31 years old. She had not expected this, or rather, she had not allowed herself to expect it, because expecting things that felt too large was a reliable way to have them not happen. She told him on a Thursday morning before Noah was up, when Silas was at the kitchen table with his coffee and the quiet expression he always had in the first half hour of the day before the work pulled him out of it. She sat down across from him and said simply, "I'm going to have a baby." He looked at her. He set down his cup. He said nothing for long enough that she almost said something to fill it, which would have been a mistake, so she waited. "Are you well?" he said. "Yes." "Are you—" He stopped. "How do you feel about it?" "Scared," she said, "and glad." A pause. Both at the same time. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, which he'd never done before, not in 6 months of side-by-side work and one 11-minute wedding ceremony. His hand was rough and heavy and warm. He didn't say anything else, and she didn't need him to. Noah took the news with characteristic 12-year-old pragmatism. "So there's going to be another one," he said at breakfast when they told him. "That's right," Clara said. "A baby." "Yes." "Babies are loud," he said, with the authority of someone who had clearly given this consideration. "Generally," Clara agreed. "But it's okay," he added. He picked up his fork. "I don't mind loud." It was the most Noah-like thing he'd ever said, and she had to look away for a moment before she trusted her face. The ranch through that summer and into fall was a different operation from the one Clara had walked into in March. Not transformed, transformation was a word for stories, and real life rarely cooperated with clean narrative, but improved, measurably, and in ways that could be tracked in the accounts and in the condition of the property and in the mood of the people living on it. The Garfield debt was on a managed schedule. The pantry was consistently stocked. The fence line was repaired. Dix, who had said about 30 words a week since Clara arrived, now said approximately 45, which she counted as a personal achievement. More cattle had been moved to market at better timing than the year before, and the return had been enough to cover the immediate obligations and set a small reserve aside. Not comfortable, not yet, but no longer desperate. There was a difference between those two things that Clara understood in her body, the particular loosening of something that had been clenched. Noah was doing mathematics at a level that was making the ranch's practical arithmetic look simple, and Clara had ordered 2 more books from the catalog in Millhaven that she thought would push him properly. He'd started reading them before they were officially given, which she also counted as a personal achievement. The pregnancy was not easy. She hadn't expected easy. By September, she was moving more slowly and with more effort, and certain tasks she'd been doing without thinking required actual planning. Getting up from the floor, carrying anything heavier than a moderate load. The simple physical act of existing in a body that was redistributing itself in unexpected ways. She adapted because adaptation was what she did. She sat down when she needed to sit. She asked Silas to carry things when her back was giving her trouble, which cost her less than she'd expected, because Silas asked and didn't wait to be told she was struggling, and she'd learned to recognize that his practical attentiveness was his version of care. It was in October that the trouble began, and it began the way real trouble often did. Not with thunder, but with something small that felt wrong. Dix came in from the south pasture on a Thursday afternoon, looking tighter in the face than usual, and reported to Silas that he'd found a gap in the fence on the eastern boundary, and signs that someone had been through it. Not just through, but had come in and looked around. Boot prints. More than one set. And the cattle in the south section were about 60 head fewer than the count from the week before. Silas went out with Dix to look at it. Clara stood on the porch and watched them ride out, and thought about the set of Silas's shoulders when Dix had told him, and about the 60 head, and about the fence that had 60 head, and about the fence that had been repaired in June. He came back 2 hours later, and his face confirmed what she'd suspected. "Rustlers," he said. "Professional. They didn't cut through. They pulled the posts and reset them, which is why Dix didn't see it earlier. They know what they're doing." "How many head?" 62. Dix's count is careful. That was real money, not catastrophic, not immediately, but at the scale they were operating, it was a significant blow to a reserve that hadn't been comfortable to begin with. "Have other ranches had problems?" Clara asked. "I need to find out." He was already thinking through it. She could see that particular focused stillness he got when the problem was real. "I'll ride to the Hendersons tomorrow. And the McCrae place." He did. The Hendersons had lost 40 head over the past 6 weeks, quietly and in ways they'd initially attributed to strays. The McCraes had lost more and had found evidence of a night camp in their eastern timber. A fire ring, cans, and the remains of a rope that had been used to tie horses. 3 ranches. Systematic, patient, professional. Silas brought the information back and laid it out at the kitchen table with the same bluntness he applied to everything. "It's organized," he said. "Not opportunists. Someone planned this." "When did the Henderson losses start?" Clara asked. "August." "And McCrae?" "Late July, early August." "So they started there," she said. "Smaller operations first, less likely to notice or have resources to respond. Now they're working up to the larger ones." Silas looked at her. "That's how I read it." "Which means they'll come back," she said. "They haven't finished." "No," he said. "They haven't." He rode into Black Ridge 2 days later to speak to the county sheriff, a man named Voss who had a reputation for responding to problems in proportion to how much political pressure was applied. Silas came home with the look of someone who had received less than he'd hoped for. Voss had listened, had written things down, had said he'd look into it, which in the language of men like Voss meant he would do something when doing nothing became more uncomfortable than doing something. Clara wrote a letter to the county seat. She also sent word through Ruth Elmore to the ranches in the valley, 6 of them within reasonable distance, to meet at the Boone place on the following Saturday. She didn't ask Silas before she did this. She told him after. He looked at her for a moment. "You organized a meeting." "Someone needed to." "That's usually—" "What? A man's job?" She said it without heat, just as a question. He was quiet for a beat. "I was going to say that's usually done by the person with the longest standing in the valley. The Henderson Ranch has been here since '61. Then ask Bill Henderson to chair it," she said. "I'll prepare the information." He almost smiled. "That'll work," he said. The meeting happened. 6 ranches represented, 12 people around the Boone kitchen table and spilling into the main room, and Bill Henderson, 70 years old, sunburned to leather, and possessed of the natural authority of someone who had survived everything the frontier had thrown at him for 30 years, sat at the head of the table and listened to Clara lay out what she'd found, which was a pattern of losses across a 6-mile stretch of valley that suggested a coordinated group moving methodically east to west. She'd drawn a map. She put it on the table where everyone could see it. There was a silence after she finished. "How do you know all this?" said a man named Carver from the McCrae operation, not hostile, but genuinely puzzled. "I asked," Clara said, "and I wrote down what everyone said, and I put it together." Bill Henderson looked at the map. "She's right," he said. "That's the pattern." He looked at the room. "Question is what we do about it." What they did was organize a watch rotation among the valley ranches, coordinated nights, signal fires to alert neighbors if something was spotted, and a formal agreement to ride to each other's aid if called. It wasn't the law. It was what people did when the law was insufficient, which on the frontier was most of the time. Clara wrote up the agreement. Everyone signed it. Okay. November settled cold and fast over the valley, and the baby was due in February, and Clara had begun to feel the weight of the pregnancy in a way that was no longer just inconvenient, but actively demanding. Her back ached by midday, she tired easily, and there were moments when she stood at the kitchen window looking out at the yard and felt a fear she hadn't let herself feel before, quiet and persistent and very specific. She wasn't afraid of dying, or not exactly. She was afraid of not finishing, not being there to see Noah grow into whatever he was going to be, not being there to see Silas stop carrying the ranch alone, not being there for the child who was coming and who didn't deserve to enter the world and lose something immediately. She didn't say any of this. She kept working. Silas noticed the fear the way he noticed most things she felt, quietly, without naming it, adjusting around it. He started making sure she was never working alone for too long. He moved the heavier kitchen stores to lower shelves without announcing he'd done it. He rode the fence lines himself without asking Dix to, so Dix could be closer to the house and yard. It was on a Friday in November, near midnight, when the dogs started. The Boone Ranch had 2 dogs, a cattle dog named Patch, who worked, and a larger, more territorial animal named Wick, who was theoretically a guard dog and had not been seriously tested in that capacity since Silas had acquired him as a pup. Both dogs started at the same time, and from their pitch and their direction, it was not a coyote or a stray. Silas was out of bed before the second round of barking had finished. Clara sat up. The room was dark. She could hear Silas pulling on clothes, the familiar sounds of him moving fast in the dark. And then he was at the door, and she could just make out his shape. "Stay here," he said. "How many?" "Can't tell yet." "Silas?" Her voice was level. "How many rifles do we have in the house?" "A beat. The one in the main room, and the pistol in the nightstand," she said. "I know where it is." "Clara." "Go," she said. "I've got Noah." He hesitated. 1 second, 2, and then he went. She heard him on the stairs, fast, and then the front door, and then nothing but the dogs and the wind and the particular thickness of a night that has something wrong in it. She got up. Getting up from bed at 7 months pregnant in the dark and fast was not a smooth operation. She managed it, found her feet, found the nightstand, found the pistol by touch. She'd handled guns her whole life. Her father had taught her the same way he'd taught her arithmetic, as a practical matter because the world required both. She checked the cylinder by feel, confirmed the load, and moved to the door. The hallway. Noah's room was at the end of it. She moved down the hall and pushed open his door. He was already sitting up in bed, fully awake, eyes catching the faint light from the window. "What's happening?" he whispered. "I don't know yet," she said. "Come with me." She took him by the arm, gently, but with enough direction that he understood this was not optional, and moved him out of his room and to the top of the stairs, where she stopped and listened. From outside, the dogs, still. And then voices, low, male, not trying to be quiet anymore the way people stopped trying to be quiet when they decided to commit to whatever they were doing. More than 2. She counted at least 3 distinct positions from the sound of them. "Upstairs," she said to Noah. "My room. The window that faces the barn." "Clara." "Now, Noah." He went. She followed him up, slower than she'd like, one hand on the wall, and positioned them both behind the bed, away from the window, where they could see the yard below without being directly in the line from outside. Below, the yard was dark except for where the moon hit the hard-packed ground between the house and the barn. She could see 2 shapes moving near the corral. Not rushing, moving with the deliberate calm of men who had done this before and were confident they had time. Silas came around the corner of the barn at a run. There was shouting, fragments. She couldn't make out words. A shot from somewhere to the right, not at Silas, but somewhere near the bunkhouse where Dix slept. Then another shot, and then she saw Silas go down, and her heart dropped out of her chest. But he was up immediately, had gone down deliberately behind the water trough, not hit. "They're between him and the house," Noah said. His voice was steady in a way that surprised her. He was looking out the window, tracking what she was tracking. "I see that. There's one near the gate." She'd seen him too. A 3rd figure near the gate to the south pasture, positioned to cut off that approach. They had the yard covered. She pushed the window open 2 inches. Cold air came in. "Noah," she said, "I need you to do exactly what I say and nothing else." "Okay." "If I fire from this window, they'll know someone is up here. That changes the calculation for them. It splits their attention." She paused. "But I'm not going to fire unless I have to. Not unless someone is getting hurt. You understand?" "Yes. What I need you to do is go to the other window, the one over the kitchen that looks east, and watch. If anyone comes to the house, you come back here immediately and you tell me." He looked at her. "You're using me as a lookout." "I'm using you as a lookout," she confirmed. Something moved in his face. Not fear exactly, more the expression of someone who has just been handed a real responsibility and is processing the weight of it. He nodded once and went to the other window. Below, the shouting continued. She could hear Silas's voice now. Not words, just the shape of it, controlled, directing. The Dix question was answered a moment later when she saw him come out of the bunkhouse, low and fast, moving to the south side of the barn. 2 of them then. Against at least 3 she'd seen, possibly more. She thought about the signal fires. They'd agreed on it at the meeting. 3 fires in quick succession from the north fence post, visible to the Henderson place and the Elroy Ranch east of that. Silas didn't know she'd thought about the logistics of this. She had, because she thought about the logistics of everything. The north fence post was 60 yards from the house. In the dark, at 7 months pregnant, in a yard with armed men in it. She sat with that calculation for about 4 seconds. Then she pulled on her boots, the practical ones, not the good ones, her coat over her nightgown, and she said quietly to Noah, "Keep watching." And she went down the stairs. The back of the house opened onto a narrow covered porch that faced north, away from where the main activity was. She knew the yard, had learned it in the first weeks the way she'd learned everything, systematically, because knowing your ground was a practical matter. From the back porch to the north fence was 60 yards of open ground, mostly in shadow on the north side because the barn blocked the moonlight from that direction. Not invisible, but possible. She moved. She moved with the careful deliberateness of someone who understood that speed was less important than quiet, that the baby made certain things impossible, and she needed to work around those impossibilities without stopping. Her back screamed at her. She ignored it. 60 yards across cold ground in the dark with a pistol in her hand and her heart beating in her ears, and she did not let herself think about what would happen if one of them came around the corner. The north fence post was where they'd sighted it at the meeting. Iron ring fixed into the top, 3 oil-soaked torches in a tin holder nailed to the south face of the post where the wind wouldn't hit them directly. Silas had prepared them a week ago after the meeting. Clara had watched him do it and had not told him she was memorizing the location and the method because she'd been hoping she would never need to use it. She struck the match on the 3rd try. Her hands were not entirely steady. The first torch caught, the second, the third. 3 quick fires in the iron ring, burning against the dark, visible for a quarter mile in the open valley. She stayed low against the fence post for a moment, catching her breath, and then she heard it, from below, the yard. Something had changed in the pattern of noise. Shouting, but different. She risked looking around the corner of the post. One of the men near the corral was looking north, looking at the fires. He said something to the man beside him. She moved back toward the house. She was 20 yards out when the shooting near the barn picked up. 2 shots in sequence, then an answering crack from Silas's position, and she went flat against the ground on instinct, one arm over her belly, the cold earth against her face. Lay there for 3 seconds. Nothing near her. She got back up. The back porch. The kitchen door. Inside. She got to the stairs and was halfway up when Noah appeared at the top. "Someone's coming to the east side of the house," he said, fast and quiet. "One man. He's got a torch." She came up the rest of the stairs as fast as she could manage and moved to the east window. The man with the torch was at the edge of the yard near the woodpile. She could see the shape of him clearly against the fire in his hand, could see the deliberate way he was holding it. Not illumination, a threat. She pushed the east window open. "Put it down," she said. Her voice came out clear and flat, without the shake she'd half expected. The man stopped. "I've got a pistol pointed at you, and I know how to use it," Claire said. "Put the torch down." A moment. Long, bad moment where nothing moved, and she held the bead on him and told herself she would do what she was prepared to do. And then the man set the torch down in the dirt. Deliberately, slowly. The way someone moves when they're deciding the odds aren't good enough. "Back up," she said. "Away from the house." He backed up. From the south, she heard it. Hoofbeats. More than 2 horses, coming fast. The Henderson place was 3 miles east, the Elroy Ranch another 2 beyond that, and a man on a good horse covering that distance at speed would be here in under 20 minutes. The fires had gone up at least 15 minutes ago, she thought. Maybe longer. She'd lost track. The hoofbeats were the signal fires working. She heard men's voices from the yard change pitch, heard the specific change that happens when people who had been confident realize something has shifted. More shouting, running. The man below her window was gone, had faded into the dark beyond the woodpile, and she let him go because she was not going to chase him across a yard in the dark at 7 months pregnant. She heard Silas shout something, his voice, clear and alive. And then she heard Bill Henderson's voice, and the voice of at least 2 other men she didn't recognize. She sat down on the floor of the hallway with her back against the wall because her back was done with her, and she had to let it have its way for a moment. Noah came and sat down next to her. He didn't say anything. After a moment, he put his arm against hers, the way kids sometimes did when they didn't have words for what they were feeling. Just contact, just presence. They sat like that until Silas came through the front door. He came up the stairs 2 at a time and stopped when he saw them both sitting against the wall, and for a moment he just stood there looking at her, taking an inventory of some kind. "Are you hurt?" he said. "No." The baby is fine. She hoped that was true. She was fairly certain it was true. We're both fine. He sat down on the floor in front of her, which was not something she'd ever seen him do, and he looked at her face for a long moment, and then he looked at Noah, and then back at her. The fires, he said, on the North Post. Yes. That was you. Yes. He breathed out slowly. Clara. It worked, she said. You were in the yard, He stopped. He was doing something with his expression that she couldn't entirely read. Not anger, something more complicated, something that had fear in it, but also something else. You could have... I know, she said. It worked. He reached out and put his hand on the side of her face, and she felt how much he was shaking and realized she was shaking too, had been shaking since the back porch, and hadn't noticed, or had noticed and decided to deal with it later. Later was apparently now. Silas, she said quietly. They're gone? Scattered. Henderson and Elroy's men ran them out the south end of the valley. We got 2 of them. The others got away, but not with anything. Dick's? Fine. Crease on his arm from a shot that barely caught him. He's angrier about it than hurt. She let out something that wasn't quite a laugh. He moved his hand from her face to her shoulder and kept it there, which meant she could feel him still shaking, or possibly she was shaking more than she'd thought, and it was actually her. Noah said, from beside her, I did the east lookout. She told me to watch the east side, and I did. I know, Silas said. He looked at his nephew. You did well. She had the plan, Noah said. I just followed it. That's usually the smartest thing anyone can do, Silas said, and something in his voice when he said it made Clara finally let go of the last thing she'd been holding. That careful, controlled composure that had gotten her through the yard and the fence post and the east window. And she leaned against Silas's shoulder and closed her eyes for a moment and let herself simply be here, on the floor of the hallway, alive and whole, listening to the voices from the yard below where Bill Henderson and Silas's neighbors were securing the property with the particular competent efficiency of frontier people who had been taking care of each other for longer than the law had been reliable. Her back ached enormously. The floor was cold. She was wearing her boots and her coat over her nightgown, and she had not combed her hair, and the baby was pressing on something that made it hard to draw a full breath. She wouldn't have traded any of it. 2 of the rustlers were in custody and in Bill Henderson's barn, bound and waiting for the county sheriff who would now have more pressure applied to him than Voss had ever faced in his career, because 6 valley ranches had signed their names to an agreement and 4 of them had ridden out in the middle of the night and would not be patient with a man who had not moved fast enough to prevent this. Clara had thought about writing another letter, to the county seat this time, with all 6 ranch names on it, but that could wait until morning. She sat on the hallway floor with Silas's hand on her shoulder and Noah pressed against her side, and outside the men secured the yard and the horses blew steam in the cold air, and somewhere the dogs had finally gone quiet, and the night moved toward morning in the slow and different way of nights that have seen too much already and are ready to be done. The baby kicked once, very definitely, as if registering an opinion about the whole affair. She's fine, Clara said out loud. She didn't know why she said she. She just did. Silas made a sound beside her that she'd come to recognize, quiet, low, from somewhere behind his ribs, the sound he made when something mattered to him more than he had words for. Yeah, he said. She's fine. They stayed there a while longer on the cold floor of the hallway, none of them quite ready to separate yet, while the valley outside came back to itself, and the morning worked itself up on the far edge of the mountains. Sheriff Voss rode out to the Boone Ranch the morning after the attack with the particular energy of a man who understood that circumstances had overtaken his earlier inaction and was now attempting to position himself on the correct side of events. He arrived to find Bill Henderson already there, and 2 men from the Elroy operation, and Dick sitting on the porch steps with his arm wrapped and his expression communicating his feelings about the previous night more clearly than any words would have. Voss took statements. He was thorough about it, more thorough than Clara had expected, which told her that the letter she'd sent to the county seat 3 weeks ago had done more work than she'd known. He interviewed Silas first, then Dix, then Henderson. He came to Clara last, standing in the kitchen where she was making coffee because there were 9 people on the property and somebody needed to, and he took off his hat when he came in and held it in both hands and asked his questions with a degree of courtesy he had not previously demonstrated in any of his dealings with the Boone Ranch. She answered everything precisely, and when he asked about the signal fires, she told him what she'd done and why, and he wrote it down without commenting on it. When he was done, he said, "Mrs. Boone, I want you to know that the county takes this seriously. The county should have taken it seriously 6 weeks ago when Mr. Boone first came to you," she said. She said it without anger, just as a statement of fact. Voss looked at his hat. "Yes, ma'am, that's fair. The 2 men in Henderson's barn need to be processed today," she said, "and I'd like copies of those incident reports within the week. I'm sending a full account to the county seat, and I'll want them to have the official record alongside." He looked up at her. "You're sending an account to the county seat?" "I'm sending an account to the county seat," she confirmed. He put his hat back on. "I'll have the reports to you by Thursday," he said. After he left, Silas leaned against the kitchen door frame and looked at her. "You already wrote to the county seat." "Weeks ago. Before the attack." "Before the attack," she said. "The attack just made the letter more relevant." He shook his head slowly, not in disagreement, but in the manner of someone recalibrating. It was a look she'd been seeing more frequently from him. Not surprise exactly, more the ongoing adjustment of a man learning that the person he'd married operated on a longer horizon than he'd initially understood. "Voss is going to charge those 2 men," he said. "He'll charge them and they'll give up the others," Clara said. "Men who scatter in the night and leave 2 of their own behind don't have much loyalty. The sheriff knows that too, which is why he's suddenly very interested in doing his job correctly." From outside, the sound of Henderson saying something and 2 of his men laughing. The loose, relieved laughter of the morning after, when the danger had passed and everyone was still standing. Clara poured a cup of coffee and handed it to Silas, and he took it, and for a moment they just stood there in the kitchen in the gray morning light, the 2 of them, and outside the valley was cold and bright and whole. "How's your back?" he said. "Bad," she said honestly. "You should rest today." "I'll rest tomorrow." "Clara, I'll rest tomorrow," she said again, but not harshly. "Today I need to make breakfast for 9 people and write 3 letters and find out if Dix's arm needs a proper doctor or just the wrap." He drank his coffee and didn't push it. He'd learned over the months which hills were worth dying on. The baby came in February, which is exactly when Clara had calculated she would. And she came fast enough that Ruth Elmore, who had been staying at the ranch for the last week in anticipation, barely had time to do more than be present in the way that competent women are present at births. Steady, practical, doing what needed to be done, and not making a performance of it. Silas spent 4 hours on the porch in the cold because he could not be useful inside and could not be anywhere else, and Noah sat beside him for most of it without being asked, their breath making small clouds in the February air, neither of them talking much. At just past 2 in the morning, Ruth opened the front door and said, "Come in, both of you." The baby was small and red-faced and had her father's dark hair, already apparent as a faint dark covering that Clara had not expected to be so moved by when she first saw it. She was not a person who became sentimental easily, and she was extremely tired, and the preceding hours had been difficult in ways she was not going to describe to anyone in detail. And still, when Silas came and sat on the edge of the bed, and she put the baby in his arms, she felt something she didn't entirely have a word for. Not happiness, exactly. Something larger and less comfortable than happiness. Something that had grief and exhaustion mixed into it, alongside the rest. He held the baby with the careful tension of a man who understood that he was holding something that could be broken, and his face did something Clara had never seen it do. Went completely unguarded, every controlled thing he carried in his expression simply gone, just the face underneath. "Margaret," Clara said. They'd agreed on the name 3 weeks ago, after his mother. "Margaret," he said, like he was learning it. Noah appeared in the doorway in his socks and his nightshirt, hair entirely chaotic, and looked at the baby with wide eyes. "She's very small," he said. "She'll get bigger," Clara said. Her voice came out rougher than she intended. She was more tired than she'd been in her life. "She looks like she's mad about something," Noah said. "She is," Ruth said from the other side of the room. "She just went through something fairly significant." Noah considered this with appropriate gravity. "Okay," he said. He came into the room and looked at the baby more closely, and something moved across his face. something young and undefended that he didn't bother to hide. "Hi, Margaret," he said quietly. The baby's face screwed up and then released into whatever passed for calm in a person who was approximately 40 minutes old. "She heard you," Noah said. "She heard a sound," Clara said. "She heard me," Noah said, with the absolute certainty of a 13-year-old who has decided something. Clara closed her eyes. She'd argue about it later. Right now, she was going to let him have it. By spring, Margaret Boone had become the effective center of gravity of the household in the way that very small people sometimes did. Not because anyone had decided this, but because it was simply true that everything organized itself around her schedule and her needs. And the people doing the organizing did not appear to resent it. Dix, who spoke 45 words a week to Clara and considerably fewer to everyone else, had taken to stopping outside the kitchen window when Margaret was inside and making low sounds at her through the glass until she noticed, which was not behavior anyone would have predicted from him, and which no one remarked on because remarking on it would have embarrassed him and also would have required acknowledging how much it revealed about a man who had been alone for a long time. The ranch in the year after the attack was a different proposition from the one it had been in either direction. The Garfield debt was fully resolved by March, the final payment made, and the documentation Clara had insisted upon keeping filed in the county clerk's office, because she'd learned from watching men like Garfield that paper was the only thing that couldn't be argued with after the fact. The cattle losses from the rustlers had been partially offset by the two men who'd been charged giving up the rest of the gang, which had led to a recovery of some of the stolen stock and a small compensation from the county for the cooperation of the Valley ranches in the whole affair. It wasn't everything, it was enough. Clara had taken on 2 new projects in the months after Margaret was born, doing them in the margins of everything else the way she'd always done things in margins. The first was a more formal accounting service for the neighboring ranches. Henderson had asked first, then the Elroys, and by summer 3 of the 6 Valley ranches were bringing their books to Clara quarterly and paying a fee for her to review them and advise on expenditures. It was modest income, but it was reliable, and it was hers specifically, which mattered to her in ways she would have found hard to articulate but didn't need to because Silas understood it without being told. The second project was Noah. He was 14 now, and the arithmetic primer had given way to proper mathematics texts that Clara had ordered from a publisher in St. Louis, and those had given way in turn to a correspondence course in natural science that she'd found advertised in the back of a catalog. He was doing work that most frontier boys his age had never seen. More importantly, he understood what he was doing. Not just executing procedures, but understanding why they worked, asking questions that required her to think before she answered. "You need to go to school," she told him one evening in September. They were at the kitchen table with his correspondence materials, Margaret asleep in the next room, Silas somewhere outside doing something to the water pump that had been needing attention for 2 weeks. Noah looked up. "I'm in school." "You need to go to a real school," she said. "With teachers who know more than I do." "Do they?" "In mathematics, certainly. In other things, probably." She pushed the textbook toward him. "There's an academy in Millhaven. Boys your age, some older. I've written to them." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the textbook. "When did you write to them?" "June." He looked up. "It's September." "I wanted to make sure it was possible before I said anything about it." "Is it possible?" "They have a scholarship for students from ranch families in the valley. Bill Henderson's grandson applied for it last year and didn't get it because he wasn't prepared enough." She looked at Noah directly. "You're prepared enough." Noah sat with this. She could see him processing it, the opportunity, the distance, what it would mean to leave. "Silas, no," he said. "I wanted to talk to you first." He was quiet for another moment. "What if I don't get it?" "Then we find another way. But you should apply, and I think you'll get it." "You think or you know?" "I think," she said. "I never know. Anyone who tells you they know is lying to you." He picked up the textbook, set it down again. "I don't want to leave," he said. It came out direct, which meant it was true. Noah had learned living with Clara that there wasn't much point in circling around the thing you actually meant. "I know," she said. But you should go," she said. "You can come back on school breaks. The ranch will still be here. We'll still be here." She paused. "You've been standing still on purpose, Noah. I've watched you do it. You make yourself smaller so you fit the space better. He looked at her. "You don't have to do that," she said. "Not here, not anywhere. You're allowed to take up the space you actually need." He was quiet for a long time after that, and she let him be quiet. And the lamp burned between them, and outside the September wind moved through the dry grass beyond the fence. "Okay," he said finally. "Okay. Will you help me with the application?" "I already drafted it," she said. "I just need your input on the parts that are about you." He almost laughed. "Of course you did." She pulled the draft from the folder she'd had sitting beside the textbook for 3 weeks and pushed it across the table, and they worked on it until the lamp burned low, and Silas came in from the water pump smelling like grease and cold air, and looked at them both bent over papers at the kitchen table and said, "What are you two doing?" And Noah told him, and Silas stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment with something on his face that he controlled quickly, and then said, "The pump's fixed," and went to wash his hands. Clara watched him go, watched the set of his shoulders. Later, when Noah had gone to bed and the house was quiet, she found Silas sitting on the porch in the cold with his coat on. "You all right?" she said. "Yeah." She sat down beside him. The sky was clear, and the stars were thick over the flatlands, and the mountains were just their dark shapes. "He's going to be something," Silas said. "Isn't he?" "He already is something," Clara said. "He's going to get the room to be more of it." Silas nodded slowly. His father would have... He stopped, started again. Robert would have been proud of him. "I know," Clara said. She'd never met Robert Boone, who had died 14 months before she arrived in Black Ridge, but she knew him through Noah, the way you came to know people through the shapes they left behind. He should know that. "I've told him." "Tell him again," she said. "Kids need to hear things more than once." Silas looked at the sky. "You think he'll come back?" he said. "After, when he's done with school." "I think he'll come back because he wants to," Clara said. "Not because he has to, and that's better." Silas was quiet. Beside them, through the kitchen window, the lamp was still lit and the papers from Noah's application were still spread on the table. "I wasn't sure about you," Silas said. "When you stepped off that train, I looked at you and I..." He stopped. "You can say it," Clara said. "I thought I'd made a mistake," he said, "sending that advertisement that far. Getting someone who didn't know the territory, didn't know the work." A pause. "I thought what the town thought for about 10 seconds. And then? And then you looked at the fence post and I saw your face," he said. "You weren't looking at it like it was a problem. You were looking at it like you were deciding how to fix it." Clara said nothing. "I thought all right," Silas said. "Maybe I didn't make a mistake." She looked at him. 10 seconds, she said. "About 10 seconds, he confirmed. "That's the fastest anyone's ever come around," she said. He did smile at that, properly, the real one, which was still rare enough that she noticed every time. "Don't tell anyone in town. They'll think I've gone soft." "They already know you've gone soft," she said. "Mabel Greer told me she saw you carrying Margaret in the general store last month and you were singing to her." He stopped smiling. "I was not singing." "That's not what Mabel said." "I was..." He looked away. "I was making sounds. It's different." "Of course it is," Clara said gravely. They sat on the porch in the cold while the night settled around them, and the stars moved their slow arc overhead. And inside the house, Margaret slept in her crib and Noah's lamp was still lit under his door. He'd taken his portion of the application papers to his room and was probably revising something she'd written, which was appropriate. It was his application. The following spring brought 2 things: Noah's acceptance letter from the Millhaven Academy, which arrived on a Thursday and was read and reread at the kitchen table until Clara had to take it away before it fell apart, and a family named Pruitt, who arrived at the gate of the Boone Ranch on a Wednesday in April, in a wagon that was carrying everything they owned and 2 children under 5 and a look of exhausted uncertainty that Clara recognized from the inside. The Pruitts, Cal and Dessa, late 20s, from somewhere in the Eastern Territories, had been moving west for 3 months after losing their farm to a bank foreclosure. They hadn't planned to stop at Black Ridge. They'd planned to keep going to the settlements further west, but their lead horse had thrown a shoe 2 miles outside of town, and Cal Pruitt had asked at the general store if there was anyone in the valley who might take them in for a few days while the horse was shod and rested. And Craddock, The same flat-faced man who had looked past Clara on her first day in town had told them to ride out to the Boone place. Clara took them in without hesitation and without asking Silas first, which was a decision she informed him of when he came in from the south pasture at noon and found a second family in his kitchen. He stood in the doorway for a moment, taking in the scene. Dessa Pruitt nursing the younger child at the kitchen table, Cal Pruitt outside with the wagon visible through the window. Two small, muddy children who had apparently discovered Margaret in her crib and were peering at her with enormous curiosity while Noah supervised with the attentiveness of someone who had appointed himself head of security. "Clara," Silas said. "Their horse needs 2 days," she said. "Possibly 3. They can sleep in the bunkhouse. Dix won't mind. I've already asked him." A beat. He said, "Fine." Silas looked at the Pruitt family, then at his wife, then at the ceiling briefly. "All right," he said. "We can spare the food," she said. "I know we can. And the horse needs the rest." "Clara," he said. "I said all right." She went back to the stove. "Cal Pruitt is a good farmer," she added. "He knows irrigation. He was explaining to me about a method they used back east that might work for the creek problem on the north boundary. He's been here 3 hours. He's been here 2 hours and 40 minutes, she said. And he's resourceful. You should talk to him." Silas looked at the back of her head with the expression she knew by now. The one that was exasperated and fond in roughly equal measure, and had no clean way to be expressed, so it just sat on his face until it resolved itself. He poured himself coffee and went outside to talk to Cal Pruitt. They talked for most of the afternoon. The Pruitts stayed 4 days, not 2. The horse needed it. And also there was the irrigation conversation that extended into a real consultation about the north boundary water issue, and also Dessa Pruitt turned out to have knowledge of medicinal plants that Ruth Elmore drove out specifically to discuss with her, which was a meeting Clara had facilitated by sending Ruth a note because she understood how these connections worked and that they needed a hand sometimes. When the Pruitts left on the 5th morning, Cal Pruitt shook Silas's hand at the gate for a long time without saying much, and Dessa Pruitt held both of Clara's hands and said, "We'll remember this. Our whole lives, we'll remember this," in the direct, simple way of someone who means exactly what they're saying. "Keep going west," Clara said. "Write when you find your place." They did write, 8 months later, a letter that arrived in the dead of winter saying they'd found land in the territory further on, that it was good land, that Cal had remembered the irrigation method and it had worked, that the children were well. The letter was passed around the kitchen table and read by everyone, and then Clara folded it into the household account book in the section she kept for things worth keeping. After the Pruitts, there were others. Not many, not a steady stream, but a pattern that established itself over that spring and summer and into the following year. Travelers passing through, families in difficulty, a young woman on her own with a wagon and a horse, and the kind of tight, controlled expression Clara had worn herself on a train platform 2 years ago. They didn't take everyone in. They didn't have the resources for everyone, but the gate was open when it could be, and the kitchen was large enough when it needed to be, and Clara applied the same practical assessment to hospitality that she applied to everything: what could be done, what was needed, what the long-term cost of not doing it was. Silas stopped being surprised by it after a while, which she took as its own kind of progress. It was Mabel Greer who told her in the summer of Margaret's 2nd year that the town had changed in its opinion. Mabel said it in the straightforward way she said most things. They were in the general store in Black Ridge, Clara making the quarterly supply run, Margaret on her hip and old enough now to find the store fascinating in all its sensory excess and want to touch everything within reach. Mabel had come in for thread and had stayed to talk, which was her customary operating mode. "You know what I heard last week?" Mabel said. "Tell me," Clara said, redirecting Margaret's hand away from a jar of hard candy. "I heard Carver's wife telling someone from the new settlement that the Boone Ranch was the best-run operation in the valley." Mabel folded her thread into her basket. "She said it just like that, like it was a simple fact." "It is a simple fact," Clara said. She also said Clara Boone was the reason. Mabel looked at her. She said that too. Clara looked at Margaret, who had successfully acquired a piece of hard candy from somewhere and was examining it with the intense focus of a small scientist. "Margaret," Clara said, "put that back. Margaret put it back with the enormous deliberateness of someone performing compliance while internally lodging a formal protest. People say what they see, Clara said. Eventually. They do, Mabel agreed. Takes them a while, but they do. She paused. You remember what Mrs. Paxton said to you? Second time you came into town? Clara remembered. I do. She asked me last month if you might be willing to look at her husband's accounts, Mabel said. He's having trouble with the books, and she heard you'd been helping the Henderson Ranch. Clara looked at Mabel for a moment. She asked you to ask me. She didn't feel she could ask you directly. Because of what she said. Yes, Mabel said simply. Clara thought about Mrs. Paxton, the pretty young woman who had said something from the doorway of the dry goods store and had gone red when Silas had turned and looked at her directly. She thought about what it cost a person to recognize they'd been wrong and need to ask for something from the person they'd been wrong about. Tell her to come to the ranch on Thursday, Clara said. I'll look at the books. Mabel smiled. I thought you'd say that. Did you? I thought you might say no first and then say that, Mabel amended. But I thought you'd get there. Clara hoisted Margaret higher on her hip and went to pay for her supplies. Mrs. Paxton, whose name was Vera, Clara learned, a detail that made her feel slightly more real and therefore easier to deal with, came on Thursday and brought the accounts and sat at the kitchen table with the careful posture of someone expecting to be made to feel bad. Clara did not make her feel bad. She'd looked at the books and identified 3 specific problems and explained them clearly and told Vera what she'd suggest for each. And Vera took notes in small, careful handwriting and said thank you 3 times and left. She came back 6 weeks later to show Clara that she'd implemented 2 of the 3 suggestions and the accounts had stabilized. She stayed for coffee. That was how it started with Vera Paxton, and how it started with 2 other women from Black Ridge who began finding reasons to come out to the Boone Ranch in the year that followed. Not confessing anything, not making speeches about being wrong, just showing up and being present in the way that people communicated regret on the frontier, which was usually by treating the person they'd wronged like someone worth talking to. Clara received them all the same way, practically, without sentiment, with coffee and honest conversation and whatever help she could actually provide. She didn't forgive in any formal or dramatic sense. She just moved forward, which was all forgiveness really was when you stripped away the ceremony. Noah left for the Millhaven Academy in August, on a morning that was hot and clear and gave no indication it understood the weight of what was happening. He'd packed his bag the night before, careful, thorough, the way Clara had taught him to do things, and he'd eaten breakfast without much appetite and said goodbye to Dix, who had shaken his hand with great seriousness and said 7 words, which was a record. Clara walked him to the gate where the stage would pick him up. He stopped at the gate and turned around and looked at the ranch, the house, the barn, the corral, the mountains behind all of it. For a long moment, the way people looked at things they were memorizing. I'll be back at winter break, he said. I know, Clara said, and in the spring. I know. He looked at her. He was taller than her now, had grown 3 inches in the past year, and hadn't quite caught up with himself yet, all arms and angles and the early suggestion of what kind of man he was going to be. You changed everything, he said. I want you to know I know that. She was not going to cry about this. You changed things yourself, she said. You lit the fires, he said. You always lit the fires. She absorbed that. Go catch your stage, she said. He hugged her, brief, a little awkward in the way that teenage boys were about these things. And then he was through the gate and down the road, and she stood watching until he was too small to make out clearly. Behind her, she heard Silas come out of the house and stop on the porch. She didn't turn around. He's going to be fine, Silas said. I know, she said. Clara. I'm fine, she said. She was mostly fine. Go check on Margaret. She was getting into the pantry when I left. He went back inside, and she stood at the gate a moment longer in the August heat with the flat land stretching out and the stage road going east, and she thought about a train platform and a worn bag and $43 in a handkerchief, and about the shape of a life that built itself not from one large decision, but from 1,000 small ones, each one pointing in the same direction. Then she turned and went back to the house, because Margaret had absolutely gotten into the pantry by now, and someone needed to deal with it. The porch step, she noticed as she went up it, was solid underfoot. Her own work, 3 years ago, boards cut and fitted on an afternoon when Silas had handed her a nail, and she'd hit her thumb twice and said things Mrs. Aldrich would not have approved of. It would last another decade at least. She went inside and found Margaret sitting in the pantry, surrounded by everything she'd pulled off the lower shelves, completely satisfied with herself, and Silas standing over her with the expression of a man who has no idea what the correct response is. "Margaret," Clara said from the doorway. Margaret looked up. "Put it back," Clara said. Margaret considered this. "All of it," Clara said. Margaret began very slowly, putting things back. Silas looked at Clara over their daughter's head, and the expression on his face was the one she'd learned to love most. Helpless, wondering, not entirely sure what he'd done to deserve any of this, but grateful for it in the deep, undemonstrative way he was grateful for most things. The kitchen was warm and smelled like the noon meal still going on the stove, and outside the ranch was making its ordinary sounds, and the life they had built here, imperfect, still difficult in the ways that life on the frontier was always difficult. Nothing like what she'd imagined when she'd sat on that train and watched the dark go past the window, was so thoroughly and completely real that she felt the weight of it like something she could hold in her hands. Not perfect. Not finished. Just hers. Margaret Boone learned to walk in October, on a morning when the first real cold had come down from the mountains and the yard was hard with frost that hadn't melted by midday. She'd been close for 2 weeks, had been pulling herself up on chair legs and table edges and the patient, long-suffering Wick, who bore this indignity with the philosophical acceptance of a very old dog. And then on a Tuesday morning, she simply decided she was done with crawling and stood up in the middle of the kitchen floor and walked 4 steps to Clara and sat down hard and looked at her own feet with an expression of profound surprise, as if they'd done something without consulting her. Clara picked her up and held her and did not make a big thing of it, because Margaret was already a child who responded to being fussed over by immediately doing whatever was being celebrated less. And that was a personality trait Clara recognized and respected even when it was inconvenient. She told Silas that evening. He was quiet for a moment and then said, "Did you see it?" "I was right there." "Good," he said. Something in his voice had the quality she'd noticed before, the particular compression of a man who felt things deeply and had spent so long not showing it that the showing had become its own kind of effort. "She's going to be trouble," Clara said. "She already is trouble." "More trouble," Clara said. "She has your stubbornness and my tendency to solve problems without asking permission first." He considered this. "That's a terrible combination." "It's a very effective combination," she said. "She'll be fine." He smiled. She still counted them. Bam. The years did what years did. They moved, and the movement was not smooth or even or kind in any consistent way. But it was forward, and forward was the only direction that mattered. There was a bad winter when Margaret was 3 that killed 14 head of cattle and damaged the barn roof and cost more to repair than they'd planned for. There was a dispute with the county over water rights on the north boundary that took Clara the better part of 2 years to resolve through a combination of documented evidence, 2 formal complaints filed with the territorial office, and a letter-writing campaign that involved every rancher in the valley, most of them signing their names to documents Clara had drafted and then explaining to them in plain language what they'd signed. The water rights dispute was settled in their favor eventually, in the way that things were settled on the frontier when someone had the patience and the paperwork to outlast the opposition. There was a summer when Noah came home from the academy and was different, quieter, more self-contained, carrying something he hadn't brought with him when he left. Clara noticed it on the first evening and said nothing. Silas noticed it and also said nothing, because they'd both learned that Noah processed things on his own timeline, and the worst thing you could do was crowd him while he was doing it. On the 3rd day, he came and sat in the kitchen while Clara was going through accounts and said, without preamble, "There's a professor at the academy who says I should apply to a college back east." Clara set down her pen. "He says I have the aptitude," Noah continued, "for engineering. There's a school in Pennsylvania. He's written a letter of recommendation already, without telling me he was going to, and sent it." "How do you feel about that?" Clara said. "I don't know," he said honestly. "That's the problem." What part don't you know? He was quiet for a moment, turning a pencil in his fingers. He was 17 now, and the angles she'd noticed the year he left had resolved into something more finished. A young man who was good-looking in an understated way and didn't seem particularly aware of it, which was its own kind of advantage. "I don't know if I want to go that far," he said. "I don't know if I want to go that far." "Those are different questions," Clara said. "I know." "The second one is the important one," she said. "The first one is just logistics." He looked at her. "You think I should go?" "I think you should apply," she said. "That's not the same thing. Find out if you get in. Find out what it looks like, then decide." "What if I get in and I still don't know?" "Then you come and talk to me again," she said. "We'll work through it." He nodded, and she could see him filing it. The way he'd always filed things, she said, not dismissing them and not immediately accepting them, just setting them somewhere accessible for later consideration. It was one of the things she'd always liked most about him. "She wrote to me," he said, after a moment, not explaining who she was. Clara waited. "A girl from Millhaven, from one of the families that board students at the academy." He looked at the pencil. "She's been writing to me for 3 months." "And you've been writing back," Clara said. Not a question. "Yeah." Clara picked up her pen again and made a note in the accounts that didn't need making, just to give him somewhere to look other than at her. "What's her name?" "Louisa," he said. "Louisa Hart." "Tell me about her." He did, and the way he talked about Louisa Hart told Clara more than the content did. The particular quality of attention in his voice, the way he chose his words more carefully than usual, which was how Noah expressed things that mattered to him. She listened and asked questions and didn't offer any opinions she hadn't been asked for, which was its own kind of love, the kind that trusted the other person to find their own way without being guided every step. Noah applied to the college in Pennsylvania. He got in. He spent a month at the ranch that summer before he left, and in that month he fixed the section of fence on the east boundary that had been needing attention since spring, and reorganized the bunkhouse with Dix in a project that both of them pretended was Dix's idea, and he spent a lot of time in the evenings reading to Margaret, who was now 5 and had opinions about everything, including which stories were acceptable and which were not. The morning he left for the east was different from the morning he'd left for Millhaven. He was older, the distance was longer, and all 3 of them understood that this departure was a different kind of crossing than the last one. Clara packed food for his journey, practical food, things that kept, nothing sentimental. Silas took him aside in the yard before the stage came, and she didn't try to hear what was said because it wasn't hers to hear. At the gate, Noah looked at her the way he'd looked at the ranch that first morning, taking something in that he planned to carry. "You know what I figured out?" he said. "Tell me." "That day on the road, when I found you walking to the ranch, I was actually coming into town. Silas had sent me for something at the general store." He paused. "I turned around. When I saw you carrying that bag, I just turned around and walked you home instead." Clara looked at him. "I don't know why," he said. "I just knew I should." She reached up and put her hand on the side of his face, the way Silas had once done to her on a hallway floor in the middle of the night, and he let her. "Go become what you're going to be," she said. He left. And this time she didn't stand at the gate watching the road, because Margaret was beside her and had found an interesting beetle in the dirt and needed someone to confirm that it was, in fact, the most interesting beetle anyone had ever seen. And life continued in the way that life continued, not pausing for grief or distance, just moving, always moving, and you either moved with it or you stood still and watched it go without you. Dix died in the spring when Margaret was 6, quietly and in the bunkhouse and in his sleep, which was the best that could be hoped for a man who had worked hard his whole life and asked for very little. He had no family they could find, which meant the Boones buried him in the corner of the property near the north fence, where he'd spent a lot of his evenings sitting and looking at the mountains when the day was done. Clara wrote a short account of his life as she'd known it, based on the things he'd said and the things that could be inferred from what he hadn't said, and she read it at the burial because someone needed to say something, and she'd known him as well as anyone. Silas stood beside her with his hat in his hands and his face doing the controlled thing it did when the feeling was too large and the expression wouldn't hold it. Margaret held Clara's hand and was very quiet, because she was 6 and she understood that this was one of those situations where quietness was the right thing, even if she wasn't sure exactly why. After, Silas found a young man named Gil Ferris in Black Ridge who needed work and knew cattle and was careful with equipment, which was the thing Silas valued most in a hired hand after the competence. Gil Ferris was 22 and from somewhere west and talked a reasonable amount more than Dix had, which took some adjustment, but he was good with horses and better with cattle, and he helped Margaret catch her beetle one afternoon without being asked and without making a production of it, which meant he passed the only test that mattered in the Boone household. The ranch, by the time Margaret was 7, was not the same ranch Clara had walked into on a March afternoon 8 years earlier. Some of the change was visible. The house properly maintained now, the barn roof replaced 2 years ago, the fence lines running clean and solid, the outbuildings expanded to include a proper smokehouse and a storage structure for equipment. Some of the change was in the numbers. The herd had grown, the accounts were organized and healthy, in the specific way of a place where every decision was made with an understanding of the full financial picture, and the water rights resolution had opened up the north pasture in ways that made the summer grazing more reliable than it had been in years. But the change that meant the most wasn't in the property or the numbers. It was in what the property had become in the valley. Not just a ranch, but a kind of fixed point, a place where things happened and people gathered and the door was open when it could be, and sometimes when it probably shouldn't be. The valley ranches all knew the Boone place. The people passing through the territory knew it by reputation, if not by experience. When there was a valley-wide problem, and there were always valley-wide problems, drought and market fluctuations, and the occasional return of the kind of lawless disruption that the frontier attracted, the conversation about it happened, more often than not, at the Boone kitchen table. Clara had not sought this. She'd been too busy with the specific next problem in front of her to seek anything beyond it, but she'd built it anyway, without noticing, the way you sometimes built things. Not from a plan, but from the accumulated weight of 1,000 individual decisions, each one small, each one pointing in the same direction. Vera Paxton, whose husband's accounts Clara had been reviewing for 5 years, brought her daughter to the ranch one afternoon that summer and asked Clara, with the careful dignity of a woman who had thought a long time about how to phrase something, whether she would be willing to teach the girl what she knew about household accounts and financial management. "The girl's 15, Vera said. "She's bright, brighter than I was, and there's no one in town who—" She stopped. "There's no one who teaches this to girls." Clara looked at the daughter, a composed, watchful 15-year-old named Ada, who had Vera's dark eyes and apparently none of Vera's early tendency to make judgments based on appearance, or if she had it, she was young enough that it hadn't calcified yet. "What do you want to learn?" Clara asked her directly. Ada looked her straight back. "Everything," she said. "That'll take a while," Clara said. "I'm not in a hurry," Ada said. Clara hired her on Thursday afternoons. Ada Paxton turned out to be one of the sharpest students Clara had taught since Noah, with the specific gift of immediately understanding the practical application of abstract principles. She could look at a set of numbers and see what story they were telling before Clara had finished explaining the method. By the following spring, she was doing the initial review of 2 of the Valley Ranch's quarterly accounts before Clara made her own assessment, and the 2 of them were rarely in disagreement. On an afternoon in April, when Ada was working at the kitchen table and Clara was nearby dealing with something that needed dealing with, Ada said, without looking up from the ledger, "My mother told me what she said when you first came, what she said from the doorway." Clara was quiet. "I want you to know I think she was wrong," Ada said, still not looking up. "I think she knows it too now. She just doesn't know how to—" "She came on Thursday," Clara said. "Every Thursday for 5 years, that's how she said it." Ada looked up. She was 16 now, and the watchful quality had developed into something more specific, an ability to look at a situation and understand what was actually happening in it beneath the surface of what was being said. It was going to serve her very well, Clara thought. It served most women very well, the ones who cultivated it. "Is that enough?" Ada asked. "For you?" Clara thought about it honestly, because the question deserved honesty. "It's what people can do," she said finally. "Usually they can't unsay things. They can only do different things after." She paused. "I don't need her to unsay it. I need it to not be the thing she believes anymore. Do you think it's not? I think she sent her daughter to learn from me, Clara said. I think that answers the question. Ada considered this and then went back to the ledger, and Clara went back to what she'd been doing, and the afternoon moved through the kitchen in the particular golden way of April afternoons in the valley, and outside Margaret could be heard somewhere in the yard engaged in a one-sided argument with something. A chicken, probably, or possibly the fence. She had strong feelings about both. And the ranch breathed around them in the ordinary way it breathed, which was the best way, the only way that really meant anything. Noah came home the summer he was 22, after 4 years in Pennsylvania, and a 5th year working with an engineering firm in St. Louis that had taken him on the strength of his academic record and his practical experience on a working ranch, which turned out to be a combination that engineering firms valued more than he'd expected. He came home with Louisa Hart, who had traveled out to meet the family, and who turned out to be a small, precise, quietly funny woman who took one look at the Boone kitchen and the Boone ranch and said, with the directness of someone who didn't see a reason to be indirect, I understand now why he talks about this place the way he does. How does he talk about it? Claire asked. Louisa looked at her. Like it's where he learned what things were supposed to look like, she said. Clara absorbed that. Noah, standing behind Louisa, looked at Clara with an expression she recognized, the one he'd had at 12 on a road outside Black Ridge, turning around to walk a stranger home for no clear reason. It was the same face, just older, more settled in itself. She's always like this, he told Louisa, nodding at Clara. She never responds to things the way you think she will. I like it, Louisa said. I know, he said. I thought you would. He stayed for 3 weeks. In those 3 weeks, he helped repair the north fence and had a series of conversations with Silas that Clara was not party to and didn't try to be, about the ranch and the operation and what the next 10 years looked like. He played with Margaret for hours. She was 8 now and had been waiting for months for his return and had a comprehensive list of things she needed to show him, organized by category, which was a trait that no one in the family had any difficulty identifying the origin of. He told them about Pennsylvania, about the engineering work, about Louisa and the future they were considering. He spoke with the ease of someone who had found the shape of his life and was comfortable inside it, not because the shape was perfect, but because it was genuinely his. He'd built it, chosen it, worked for it. On his last evening, he sat on the porch with Clara after everyone had gone in the dark, the way they'd never actually done when he was younger because the evenings were work time and there had always been something else needing doing. The valley was quiet. The mountains were their shapes. I want to ask you something, he said. Go ahead. Did you know? When you first came here, did you know it was going to work out? She thought about the honest answer, which was the only kind she'd ever given him. No, she said. I knew I was going to stay. That's different from knowing it would work. What's the difference? Knowing it would work means you're guaranteed something at the end, she said. Deciding to stay just means you're committed to finding out. A pause. Most people want the guarantee before they'll make the commitment, but the guarantee doesn't come first. It never comes first. He was quiet for a moment. Was it worth it? All of it. The hard parts. She looked at the ranch, the house with its solid porch boards, the barn with its replaced roof, the fence lines running clean in the dark, the light in the kitchen window where Silas was probably reading and Margaret had probably fallen asleep in her chair. She thought about a train platform and a worn bag, about $43 in a handkerchief, about the sound of laughter that followed her down the main street of Black Ridge on the first day, and the quality of silence that greeted her now when she walked through it. Every single day, she said. Noah nodded. He sat with that for a while, and then he said, Thank you. For all of it. I don't think I've said that plainly enough. You've said it, she said, in every way that counted. He left the next morning with Louisa, heading back east to the life he was building, and this time Clara watched the road until the wagon was gone and then stood at the gate another minute in the morning air, just standing, not thinking about anything in particular, just being in the place she had chosen, and that had, in the way of things that were chosen freely, chosen her back. Margaret was 10 when she asked the question. She asked it at the kitchen table on a Saturday afternoon, out of nowhere, in the direct manner she'd always had, No preamble, no working up to it, just the question sitting there like something she'd been carrying and had decided to set down. Did people really say bad things about you when you first came? Clara was mending something and kept mending it. Yes, she said. What kind of bad things? Things about how I looked, Clara said. About whether I was capable of doing the work. About whether someone like me belonged here. Margaret considered this with the serious face she used for things that mattered to her, which was most things. What did you do? Kept working, Clara said. That's it? That's most of it. Clara set down the mending. What made you ask? Ellie Craddock said something to me at the store, Margaret said. About you. About when you first came. She paused. She said her mother told her. Clara looked at her daughter, 10 years old, dark-haired like her father, with the broad-shouldered build that she'd inherited from Clara's side, and that she moved through the world in with the complete unself-consciousness of a child who hadn't yet been taught to be ashamed of it. What did Ellie say? She said people thought you were too fat to last a week, Margaret said, with the flat accuracy of a child reporting a thing without yet having decided what she thought about it. Is that true? That's what they thought, yes. Why? Clara thought about the real answer, the full one, the one that was complicated and true at the same time. Because people often judge what they see first, she said, and what they see first is usually the surface, the size of a person, or how they dress, or where they come from, and they build a whole set of conclusions from that one thing before they know anything else. That's stupid, Margaret said. It's human, Clara said. It's what people do when they haven't learned to look past the first thing. Did it hurt? Margaret said. When they said it, a beat. Yes, Clara said. Of course it did. But you stayed anyway. But I stayed anyway. Margaret was quiet for a moment, turning this over. Ellie said it like it was supposed to make me feel bad, she said. About you. Did it? Margaret looked at her with an expression that was so thoroughly Silas, the measuring look, the absolute absence of pretense, that Clara almost smiled. No, she said. It made me feel like Ellie doesn't know anything about anything. Ellie is probably a perfectly fine person who repeated something her mother said without thinking it through, Clara said. Don't hold it against her. Even if her mother was wrong, especially then, Clara said, people pass things along. The only question is whether you take what's been handed to you and keep passing it, or whether you put it down. Margaret thought about this for a long time, and the way she thought about things that were going into the place in her mind where the important things went. Then she picked up her book. She was 10 and read with the same absorbed focus Noah had at that age, and opened it to her page. After a moment, she said, without looking up, I think you're the strongest person I know. Clara picked up the mending. You don't know very many people yet, she said. I know enough, Margaret said. They sat in the kitchen in the afternoon light, the two of them, and the ranch moved around them in its ordinary rhythms, and that was all. No ceremony, no lesson formally concluded, no moment that announced itself as significant. Just a woman and her daughter in a kitchen talking about something real. That was how things actually passed from one person to another. Not in speeches, not in grand gestures. In these small moments, over kitchen tables, while one person mended something and the other read a book. The town of Black Ridge changed in the years that followed, as frontier towns did. Grew a little, settled a little, lost some people and gained others, and the rough edges were smoothed by the simple passage of time and the accumulation of enough ordinary life to make the extraordinary feel less necessary. A proper school was built when Margaret was 12, and a small lending library the year after that, which Clara had helped organize and fund by writing 17 letters to various organizations and publishers in a campaign that took 8 months, and that Silas had eventually stopped asking about the status of because he understood it would be done when it was done. The women who had started coming to the Boone Ranch, Ada Paxton and 2 others, then 3 more, had become, without anyone formally declaring it, something like a network. They shared information about markets and prices and legal matters that affected their families, and they helped each other with the particular problems that women on the frontier dealt with and that men were often too busy or too proud to acknowledge as problems in the first place. Clara had not founded anything. She had simply been consistent and available and honest, and consistency and availability and honesty, applied over enough time, built things whether you intended them to or not. Silas, at 53, was the same man he'd been at 42 in all the ways that counted, and different in the ways that indicated someone had been living rather than just enduring. He was slower in the mornings than he used to be, which he would not have admitted to anyone, but which Clara had managed by making sure the coffee was always ready before he came down. He'd lost some hearing on the left side from an incident with equipment that he also wouldn't discuss, so she'd learned to position herself on his right when they were talking outside. He still didn't make conversation for its own sake, still moved through his days with the focused deliberateness of a man for whom work was not separate from living, but the main expression of it. He was, in his way, one of the most reliable people she had ever known. Reliable not in the sense of being predictable, but in the sense of being present, consistently and completely, in the life they'd built. He told her once, after a Valley meeting that had run long and ended in the kind of sprawling, inconclusive way that meetings on the frontier often ended, that he'd heard one of the men from the newer settlement in the north part of the valley refer to the Boone Ranch as the place that holds the valley together. "He said that?" Clara said. "That's what I heard." "That's an exaggeration." "Probably," Silas said, "but it's a direction." She thought about that. A direction, not a destination. That was about right. It was Ruth Elmore in the end who said it plainly. Ruth, who had driven out on the second week Clara had been at the ranch to ask if she was staying, who had come back every few weeks since without being asked, who had become over the years something that occupied a category in Clara's life that she didn't have a precise name for, somewhere between a neighbor and an older sister, and the kind of friend who earned the name by showing up in the specific moments that required it. Ruth said it on a Sunday afternoon, sitting at the Boone kitchen table with her coffee going cold, because she'd been talking for an hour, which was unusually long even for her. She was 63 and had buried her husband 2 years earlier, and wore his absence on her in the particular way of people who had organized their lives around someone for decades, and were still rearranging. "I want to tell you something," Ruth said. "I've been waiting for you to get to the point," Clara said. Ruth looked at her. "When you came here," she said, "this was a place that was going to fail. Not dramatically, just quietly run out of what it needed and stop." She paused. Silas was going to lose it, not because he was wrong about anything, just because the work was too much for one person, and Noah was too young, and the finances were too far gone. Clara waited. "What you did here," Ruth said. "People don't say it right when they talk about it. They say she fixed the ranch, she helped with this, she stood up to those men in the night, and those things are true." She set down her cup. "But what you actually did was you decided this place was worth it before it had given you any reason to decide that, before it had earned it. You just decided, and then you acted like you'd decided." Clara was quiet. "Most people wait for proof," Ruth said. "They wait for a reason. They want the place to show them first that it's going to work, and then they'll commit." She shook her head. "You didn't do that. You committed first, and everything else came from that." Clara looked at her coffee cup. "I didn't have anywhere else to go," she said. "That's not why," Ruth said. "Don't say it like it was desperation. I know the difference between someone doing something because they've got no choice and someone doing it because they've decided." Clara thought about the honest answer, the one she'd been the closest to understanding for years but hadn't tried to put into words because it hadn't needed words. "I'd spent a long time being the person that other people decided about," she said finally. "How much space I should take up. Whether I was worth taking seriously. Whether someone like me could do things, or have things, or matter." She paused. "I was tired of waiting for other people's decisions. I just started making my own." Ruth looked at her for a long moment. "That's the thing," she said. "That's exactly the thing." Outside, Margaret could be heard coming across the yard from the direction of the barn, talking to Gil Ferris about something with the characteristic confidence of a 10-year-old who believed her opinions were valid and expected them to be treated as such. Silas's voice answered from somewhere, short, patient, the voice he used with his daughter, which was different from the voice he used with everyone else in a way Clara had noticed from the first week. Ruth looked toward the window. "What's that girl going to be?" she said. "Do you know yet?" "No," Clara said, "but I know she'll decide for herself. Like her mother, Ruth said. Like herself, Clara said. She doesn't need to be like me. She just needs to be like her. Ruth picked up her coffee, cold now, and drank some of it anyway. You're a piece of work, Clara Boone. I've been told, Clara said. There was a morning in the fall of that year when Clara woke before the house did, before Silas, before Margaret, before Gil in the bunkhouse, and she lay in the gray early light for a moment just being awake, which was a thing she rarely did because being awake had always meant getting up and starting. She lay there and she thought about a train and a platform and a worn canvas bag, about a road outside of town and a skinny boy in a battered hat who had turned around for no reason he could explain, about a kitchen table and account books and a letter to a man named Garfield that she'd written 3 drafts of before she was satisfied, about a cold November night and 60 yards of open ground between the house and the north fence post and the particular way her hands had shaken on the match, about a hallway floor and Silas shaking beside her and a baby who kicked once, firmly, to register her opinion. She thought about all of it, not with nostalgia, which was a way of making the past softer than it had been, but with the clear-eyed recognition of someone looking at a thing they had actually built and seeing it whole, and knowing that whole meant imperfect and unfinished and ongoing, not completed and perfect and done. She was 40 years old. The ranch was alive and working. Her daughter was sleeping down the hall. Noah was somewhere in Pennsylvania building bridges and writing letters that arrived every few weeks. Silas was beside her, breathing the deep, slow breath of a man who worked hard and slept well, which was its own kind of testimony. She had not changed Black Ridge. That was too large a claim, and it wasn't the point. She had not proved anything to the people who'd laughed on that platform, because proving things to people who'd decided not to see you was a project without a finish line, and she'd given it up as a goal before the first month was out. What she had done was simpler and harder than that. She had shown up. She had stayed. She had done the next thing, and then the thing after that. Not because she was certain it would work, not because anyone had told her she was capable of it, not because the ground was clear and the path was obvious, but because the work was in front of her, and she had decided she was equal to it. That was all. That was the whole of it. And it turned out that was enough. Not because the world rewarded it, not because effort guaranteed outcomes, not because any of the hard nights and the bad seasons and the years when the finances were frightening had resolved cleanly or on schedule. It was enough simply because a life built from that kind of decision, that kind of daily choosing, accumulated into something real, something that lasted, something that mattered to more than one person. She had learned that belonging was not given. It was not a gift that other people extended to you when you'd met their criteria or satisfied their requirements or fit yourself into the shape they'd decided was acceptable. Belonging was something you built with your hands, in the specific place you'd chosen, over time, out of the material that was actually available to you, which was never exactly what you'd have ordered if you'd been given the choice. You just used what was there. She heard Margaret stir down the hall, the small sounds of a child waking, indeterminate and brief, and then quiet again, still sleeping. Beside her, Silas shifted without waking. The morning was coming up now, the gray turning at the edges toward something lighter, the mountains beginning to separate themselves from the sky. Clara lay there another minute, an unusual luxury, a minute claimed just for the claiming of it. And then she got up, because the coffee wouldn't make itself, and the morning was starting and the day was full of everything that needed doing. She dressed quietly, went downstairs, and put the kettle on. The kitchen was still and cold and familiar in every detail. The shelves she'd organized 8 years ago and reorganized twice since. The account books on their shelf in the order she kept them. The chair by the window where Ruth always sat when she came. The marks on the door frame where she'd been measuring Margaret's height every birthday with a pencil. The lowest mark at the level of a 1-year-old who had just learned to walk and was surprised by her own feet. The water began to heat. Outside the window, the yard was just visible in the early light. Frost on the ground, the barn solid and weathered, the fence lines running straight to the edge of what she could see. She stood at the window and watched the morning come, the way it always came, unhurried, indifferent, equally available to everyone who was awake to see it. She was awake. She had always been awake. The kettle began to sound. She turned from the window and made the coffee, and when it was ready she poured 2 cups, because Silas would be down in 20 minutes, and she set his on the table where he would find it, and she took hers to the window and held it in both hands and looked at her ranch in the early light of another ordinary morning, which was the only kind worth having. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was in all the ways that counted, everything.